a critical boundary condition to know for MCQs. The Mississippian culture was not the same as a state-level empire like the Aztec Triple Alliance or the Song Dynasty in China. It was organized around chiefdoms, politically autonomous communities led by chiefs who derived authority from religious and ceremonial roles, not bureaucratic institutions. If a question asks you to compare Mississippian political organization to a large centralized empire, the correct answer will emphasize decentralization and chiefly authority, not a unified government with a standing army or a complex taxation bureaucracy. The Pueblo peoples, architecture against the sky. Now travel west with me, about 1,500 miles, to the high desert plateaus of the Colorado Plateau, what is today New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and Utah. Here, the challenge is not river flooding or forest clearing. Here, the challenge is an almost brutal scarcity of water. The Pueblo peoples, a term that encompasses several related cultures, including the ancestral Pueblo, whom older textbooks may call Anasazi, though that term is now considered outdated and College Board has moved away from it, responded to this environment with remarkable ingenuity. Their signature achievement was multi-story stone and adobe architecture built into cliff faces or on mesa tops. Think of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, a structure containing over 600 rooms built in a D-shaped arc, or the cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde, tucked into the sides of canyon walls. These were not just impressive feats of engineering, they were strategic responses to the environment. Elevation provided defense, cliff overhangs provided shade in summer and retained heat in winter, and the concentrated layout supported a communal social organization very different from the hierarchical chieftaincy of the Mississippians. Pueblo society was more egalitarian than Mississippian society, and this contrast is one of College Board's favorite comparison setups, where Mississippian elites lived on top of mounds literally elevated above commoners. Pueblo communities were more horizontally organized, with shared plazas, communal food storage, and religious ceremonies conducted through kiva structures, circular, partially underground ceremonial rooms that served as the spiritual and social center of community life. If you see an FRQ asking you to compare how two North American societies reflected their environmental or geographic contexts, the Mississippian Pueblo contrast is almost perfectly engineered to answer it. Common traps and FRQ scoring points. The single most common trap on MCQs about these societies is conflating them with Mesoamerican civilizations. The Mississippians built mounds, not pyramids. They did not have a writing system. They did not have large draft animals. They were influenced by Mesoamerica, maize being the clearest example, but they developed distinct cultural forms. Similarly, Pueblo peoples are sometimes confused with nomadic plains cultures. Do not make that mistake. Pueblo peoples were sedentary, agricultural, and architecturally sophisticated. For FRQ rubrics, when College Board asks you to describe a North American society, they want three things: a specific society name, a specific characteristic, and evidence. The Mississippian culture, a hierarchical chiefdom-based society, constructed large earthen mounds at Cahokia as platforms for elite and ceremonial activity, hits all three. Practice building those sentence-level precision habits now. Both of these cultures also connect forward to Unit 4's discussion of how European colonization disrupted existing societies. The Mississippian culture was already declining before Spanish contact, likely due to a combination of drought, disease along trade routes, and environmental pressure, while Pueblo peoples faced direct Spanish colonization in the late 16th and 17th centuries, culminating in the Pueblo Revolt of 1680, one of the most successful indigenous resistances to European colonization in North American history. As you've just seen, the story of North American societies is rich with complexity, and that complexity connects directly to the even wider global story we'll explore next as we move deeper into Unit 1's examination of how societies across Africa, Asia, and the Americas were building interconnected networks of exchange in the centuries approaching 1000 to 100 CE. 1.4d, the role of agriculture, maize, potato, in supporting American state building. Why crops are the foundation of civilization. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're trying to build a city, not just a village, but a genuinely complex society with rulers, priests, armies, and marketplaces. What's the single most important thing you need before any of that can happen? Food. Reliable, storable, calorie-dense food. Without it, everyone's too busy hunting and foraging to do anything else. The moment a society cracks the code on producing surplus food, more than it needs to survive day to day, it unlocks everything else. Specialization, hierarchy, trade, monuments, and yes, states. That is the core argument you need to carry into every AP exam question about agriculture and American state building. The two crops at the center of this story are maize, corn, and the potato, and understanding why these specific plants matter, not just that they existed, is what separates a 3 from a 5. Maize and the rise of Mesoamerican and North American states. Maize was domesticated in Mesoamerica, in the region of modern-day Mexico, from a wild grass called teosinte, around 9,000 years ago. But here's what the AP exam wants you to understand. Domestication didn't immediately produce civilizations. It took thousands of years of selective cultivation to turn scraggly wild grass into the high-yield crop that could support urban populations. By the time of the Maya, roughly 250 to 900 CE, and the Aztec Empire, 1300s to 1521 CE, maize had become the backbone of everything. Think of maize as the ancient equivalent of a universal power grid. It was calorie-dense, it could be dried and stored for long periods without spoiling. It grew in a wide range of climates, and it could be prepared dozens of ways: tortillas, tamales, fermented drinks. That storability is crucial. When you can store food, you can feed non-farming specialists, soldiers, priests, bureaucrats, artisans, through the dry season or through a bad harvest. Stored food is, in a very real sense, stored political power. For the Aztec state specifically, maize supported a tribute system that was the engine of imperial expansion. Subject peoples paid tribute partly in the form of maize, which then flowed into Tenochtitlan's granaries and fed the armies and administrative class. The AP exam will frequently ask you to connect agricultural surplus to political complexity, and this tribute to granary to state pipeline is your model answer. You should be able to articulate that maize surplus enabled labor specialization, which enabled social stratification, which enabled the hierarchical structures that define a state. In North America, the spread of maize northward through trade and migration transformed societies like Cahokia near modern St. Louis, which peaked around 1050 to 1200 CE. Cahokia wasn't as hierarchically complex as the Aztec Empire, but the adoption of maize agriculture is directly linked to its population explosion and monument building. Monk's Mound, the largest pre-Columbian earthwork north of Mexico, only exists because maize could feed the people who built it. This is a favorite MCQ connection because students often think of American state building as purely Mesoamerican or Andean, forgetting North American examples. The potato, an Andean state building. Now let's travel south to the Andes, where a completely different crop performed the same civilization-enabling role. The potato was domesticated in the highlands of modern-day Peru and Bolivia around 8,000 years ago, and it is one of the most efficient calorie-producing plants per acre ever cultivated by humans. In the thin air and cold temperatures of Andean elevations above 10,000 feet, environments where maize simply cannot grow reliably, the potato thrived. The Inca Empire, 1438 to 1533 CE, the largest empire in pre-Columbian American history, was built quite literally on the potato. The Inca developed a sophisticated preservation technique called chuño, freeze-dried potato, by exposing potatoes to overnight freezing temperatures at high altitude and then pressing out the moisture. Chuño could be stored for years, even decades, and transported across the vast road network the Inca built through the Andes. If maize was the Aztec Empire's fuel, chuño was the Inca Empire's battery, a long-term energy storage technology that made it possible to supply armies, feed Mita labor crews, building roads and terraces, and redistribute food across a geographically brutal landscape. The Mita system, the Incan labor tax where subjects gave labor rather than goods to the state, only functioned because the state could feed those workers from centralized potato stores. This is a critical AP connection. The crop enables the surplus, The surplus enables the storage enables the labor mobilization, and the labor mobilization builds the infrastructure that makes the state powerful. Pull that chain apart on an FRQ, and you'll earn full causation points. Common exam traps and how to avoid them. The most common trap on AP MCQs for this topic is treating agricultural development as automatic or inevitable. Students often assume that if a society grew maize or potatoes, it would naturally become a complex state. The AP exam will present you with counterexamples, societies that cultivated these crops but remained relatively decentralized, and ask you to explain the difference. Your answer should always reference additional factors: geographic concentration, irrigation systems, trade networks, and political leadership that could actually organize and redistribute surplus. Another trap is confusing correlation with causation in the wrong direction. Crops didn't create states. Human decisions about how to organize surplus production and distribution created states. Maize and potatoes were the necessary precondition, not the sufficient cause. That nuance shows up in document-based questions and long essay prompts where you need to argue for complexity rather than simple determinism. Connections to other units. This topic connects forward in powerful ways. In Unit 2, when you study the Columbian Exchange, you need to understand why the global spread of maize and potatoes after 1492 had such transformative demographic effects in Europe, Africa, and Asia, because you already know how calorie-dense and climate-adaptable these crops were. The potatoes' arrival in Ireland and the Andean highlands of China fed population booms that reshaped those societies. That's the same logic you learned here, just applied globally. It also connects to Unit 1's broader themes of state building across Afro-Eurasia. The AP exam loves to ask you to compare how wheat and rice supported state formation in Mesopotamia, China, and South Asia with how maize and potatoes supported it in the Americas. The mechanism is identical: surplus, storage, specialization, hierarchy, but the specific crops, environments, and political forms differ, and that comparison is pure gold for FRQ thesis statements. Understanding how food security translates into political power in the Americas sets you up perfectly for our next topic, where we zoom out and examine the full range of political, cultural, and economic structures that define the major civilizations of this era. 1.5 State building in Africa from c. 100 to 100 to c. 1-450. Setting the stage. Let's talk about one of the most underrepresented, yet absolutely exam-critical topics in AP World History Modern: state building in Africa between roughly 1200 and 1450. If you've ever felt like Africa gets glossed over in history classes, this section is your chance to not only fill that gap, but to genuinely impress your AP exam grader. College Board has made a deliberate effort in recent years to include more African history in both multiple choice and free response questions. So this is not the place to skim. Here's the big idea you need to anchor everything else to. Just like Europe had feudal kingdoms, just like China had dynasties, Africa had sophisticated, powerful, and often fabulously wealthy states. These weren't isolated accidents. They emerged because of specific geographic, economic, and political conditions, and they followed the same fundamental logic of state building that you'll see everywhere else in Unit 1. Keep that comparative framework in mind, because the AP exam absolutely loves to ask you to compare African states to states in other regions. Mali, the empire you must know cold. The Mali Empire is your heavyweight here. Built on the foundations of the earlier Ghana Empire, which you should know, briefly collapsed around 1200, Mali expanded to dominate the Western Sudan region of West Africa. The key word College Board uses, and the word you should use on your FRQ, is Sahel, the semi-arid zone just south of the Sahara Desert. This geographic position was everything, because it placed Mali at the crossroads of trans-Saharan trade. Think of Mali like a toll booth on the world's busiest highway. Gold from the south and salt from the north had to pass through Mali's territory, and the rulers called the Mansa taxed that trade heavily. Salt was so valuable in this period that it was genuinely traded weight for weight against gold in some accounts. When you understand that, the wealth of Mali stops sounding like an exaggeration and starts sounding like basic economics. Control the choke point, collect the revenue, fund the army, expand the state. That is the formula for West African state building, and it applies across multiple empires. The ruler you absolutely must know is Mansa Musa, who reigned roughly 133-7. His famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 is one of those rare historical events that's almost tailor-made for an AP exam question. He traveled with an entourage estimated at tens of thousands of people and distributed so much gold along his route through Cairo, across the Mediterranean world, that he actually caused inflation in Egypt for over a decade. Let that sink in for a second. One man's road trip destabilized regional economies. That's a demonstration of Mali's staggering wealth, and it's also evidence of how trans-Saharan trade connected sub-Saharan Africa to the Islamic world, and through that to the broader Afro-Eurasian trade network. College Board wants you to see Africa as connected, not isolated. Mansa Musa's Hajj is your single best piece of evidence for that argument. Islam and legitimacy. Here's a concept that connects Mali directly to other civilizations you're studying in Unit 1. Rulers used Islam to legitimize their authority. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage wasn't just a religious act, it was a political broadcast. It told the Islamic world, we are wealthy, we are pious, we are legitimate rulers. He brought back the famous Islamic scholar and architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who helped design mosques in Timbuktu and Jenne, transforming those cities into major centers of Islamic scholarship. Timbuktu in particular became a hub of learning, with its Sankor Mosque attracting scholars from across the Islamic world. The AP exam trap here is assuming that the adoption of Islam meant African rulers simply abandoned their traditional power structures. Don't fall for it. Mali's rulers, like many rulers across this period, practiced a syncretic blend. They embraced Islam for trade connections, diplomatic legitimacy, and scholarly prestige, while maintaining traditional African religious practices that cemented their authority with local populations. This same syncretic pattern shows up in Southeast Asia and in the Delhi Sultanate. So when you see a comparison question on your exam, you have multiple examples ready to deploy. The Great Zimbabwean Swahili City-States. Don't make the mistake of treating West Africa as the only story here. College Board also expects you to know about state building in other parts of Africa. The Kingdom of Zimbabwe, centered on the stone monument complex known as Great Zimbabwe, dominated southeastern Africa between roughly 1100 and 1450. Great Zimbabwe was a massive stone enclosure, no mortar, just precisely cut and stacked stone, that served as the royal palace and religious center of the Shona people. Its wealth came from controlling the gold trade routes that connected interior Africa to the Swahili coast. Speaking of the Swahili coast, those city-states like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar were thriving commercial hubs connecting the African interior to the Indian Ocean trade network. Kilwa, in particular, visited by the famous traveler Ibn Battuta in the 1330s, was described by him as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. These were not peripheral outposts. They were nodes in a global trading system stretching from China to East Africa. On your exam, if you see a question about Indian Ocean trade, the Swahili city-states are your African answer. Common exam traps and FRQ strategies, a few traps to avoid. First, never describe African states as primitive or decentralized by default. That's an outdated misconception and will cost you points. Second, don't confuse the Ghana, Mali, and Songhai empires. They are sequential, not simultaneous, and Songhai actually falls largely outside this period, peaking after 1450. Third, when the exam asks about continuities and changes in African state building, your strongest argument is that the reliance on trans-Saharan trade as the economic engine of state power is a key continuity across the entire period. For FRQ scoring, College Board rewards specific evidence. Mali was wealthy, earns nothing. Mansa Musa's 1324 Hajj destabilized Egyptian gold markets, demonstrating Mali's dominance of trans-Saharan gold trade, earns full credit. Specificity is your best friend. As you move into the next section, you'll start to see how these African trade networks intersect with the broader Afro-Eurasian exchange of goods, ideas, and peoples, which is really the central story of Unit 1 as a whole. 1.5a Mali Empire, Mansa Musa, Trans-Saharan trade, and the spread of Islam. Let's talk about one of the most jaw-dropping stories in world history, a story that involves more gold than you can imagine, a pilgrimage that literally crashed the economy of an entire region, and an empire most students haven't heard nearly enough about. We're talking about the Mali Empire, and by the time we're done here, you'll understand why College Board keeps returning to it again and again. Setting the stage. What was the Mali Empire? Picture West Africa in the 1200s and 130s and 1300s. The Sahara Desert sits to the north like a massive natural wall, but here's your first big conceptual shift. The AP exam wants you to stop thinking of the Sahara as a barrier and start thinking of it as a highway. Trans-Saharan trade routes crossed that desert like interstate highways, crossed the American Midwest, connecting the gold and salt resources of sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe and Asia. The Mali Empire sat at the critical junction of those routes, and that geographic position was the foundation of its extraordinary wealth and power. The Mali Empire rose to prominence in the 1200s after the decline of the earlier Ghana Empire, which is itself a common MCQ trap. College Board loves to test whether you know that the ancient Ghana Empire and the modern nation of Ghana are not the same place. The Ghana Empire was located in the western Sahel region, and Mali later absorbed much of that territory. Keeping those two empires distinct is essential. Mansa Musa, the king who shook the world. Now, here's where it gets truly unforgettable. Mansa Musa ruled the Mali Empire from approximately 1312 to 1337, and he remains one of the wealthiest individuals in all of recorded history. His empire sat atop two of the most valuable commodities of the medieval world, gold from mines in regions like Bambouk and Boer, and salt from the Saharan mines at Tagaza. Think of it like controlling both the oil fields and the refinery. Everyone needed what Mali had. But Mansa Musa's most consequential act, the one that put Mali on the map quite literally, was his Hajj, his Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 to 1325. This wasn't just a religious journey. It was a geopolitical spectacle on an almost incomprehensible scale. Mansa Musa traveled with a caravan, estimated at 60,000 people, including soldiers, enslaved people, officials, and merchants, along with somewhere between 80 and 100 camels, each carrying roughly 300 pounds of gold dust. He gave away gold so lavishly in Cairo and along the route that he triggered a decades-long inflation crisis in North Africa and the Middle East. Economists estimate the region's gold-based economy didn't recover for 12 years. When a single individual's generosity can destabilize regional currency, you're dealing with staggering wealth. For the AP exam, Mansa Musa's Hajj matters for several interconnected reasons. First, it demonstrated the spread of Islam into sub-Saharan Africa, a process that happened gradually through trade contacts rather than military conquest, which is an important distinction you'll need for FRQ responses. Second, the pilgrimage brought Mali to the attention of the wider Islamic world and European cartographers. After 1324, Mali appeared on European maps, including the famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, which depicted Mansa Musa sitting on a throne holding a gold nugget. Third, Mansa Musa returned with North African scholars, architects, and religious leaders, most famously the poet-architect Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who helped build the iconic Djinguereber Mosque in Timbuktu. Trans-Saharan trade, the engine of empire. You need to have a firm mental model of how trans-Saharan trade actually functioned. Camel caravans were the trucks of the medieval world. Camels could carry heavy loads, survive without water for extended periods, and navigate sandy terrain. The main commodities flowing southward across the Sahara included salt, manufactured goods, textiles, and Islamic scholarship. Moving northward came gold, enslaved people, ivory, and kola nuts. That exchange, gold and goods from the south, salt and Islamic culture from the north, created what historians call a commercial network that integrated West Africa into the wider Afro-Eurasian world. Timbuktu deserves special attention here. By Mansa Musa's reign, Timbuktu had grown from a seasonal camp into a major commercial and intellectual center. The Sankor Mosque and its associated university attracted scholars from across the Islamic world, and at its peak, the city housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts. If College Board asks about centers of learning and cultural exchange in this period, Timbuktu is your answer for West Africa, just as Baghdad was for the Islamic heartland. Islam and cultural diffusion in Mali. A concept that runs through much of Unit 1 and reappears in later units is the relationship between trade and religion. Islam spread into West Africa primarily through trade networks, not through jihad or military campaigns. Muslim merchants established communities in West African trading cities. Local rulers found practical benefits in converting Arabic literacy, connections to wider trade networks, diplomatic legitimacy with North African partners, and Islam gradually took root. This pattern of elite adoption followed by broader cultural diffusion is something College Board tests repeatedly. Mansa Musa himself was a devout Muslim who used his faith to legitimize his rule, build institutions, and connect Mali to the broader Islamic world. Here's a subtle but important distinction for your FRQ writing. Islam in Mali was syncretic, meaning it blended with existing local traditions. Mansa Musa's successors and many subjects maintained pre-Islamic practices alongside Islamic ones, and later Islamic reformers in the region would criticize this syncretism. That nuance signals historical thinking about continuity and change rather than sudden replacement. Connections across the course. Don't make the mistake of treating Mali as an isolated topic. College Board connects it explicitly to the Indian Ocean trade networks covered in Unit 2, because both systems demonstrate how commerce drove cultural and religious exchange across long distances. It also connects forward to Unit 4, where the disruption of trans-Saharan trade by Portuguese coastal trade routes beginning in the 1400s directly undermined West African empires like Mali's successor state, Songhai, and the Mali Empire's use of enslaved people in trade, both as a commodity and as labor, connects to the broader context of slavery before the Atlantic slave trade of Unit 4 and Unit 5. The most common FRQ trap with this topic is treating Mansa Musa's pilgrimage as purely religious, rather than recognizing its economic, diplomatic, and cultural dimensions simultaneously. When you see a document about his Hajj on an exam, ask yourself, what does this reveal about trade, religion, and political legitimacy all at once? With the Mali Empire's gold, scholarship, and faith woven into the global tapestry, we're ready to move east and explore the rich networks of the Indian Ocean world, another trading system that, like trans-Saharan commerce, carried not just goods but ideas, religions, and people across seemingly impossible distances. 1.5b Great Zimbabwe and the East African city-states, Kilwa, trade and political organization. Setting the scene, Africa's forgotten powerhouses. Let's talk about two of the most impressive and chronically underappreciated civilizations you'll encounter on the AP World History exam, Great Zimbabwe and the Swahili Coast city-states, especially Kilwa. Think of them as the hidden gems of the AP course, the questions that separate the students who crammed a Eurocentric review sheet from the students who actually understand how interconnected the medieval world was. If you can speak confidently about these two, you're already thinking like a historian who scores fives. Here's your mental anchor. Imagine the Indian Ocean as a giant highway, and the East African coast as its western terminal. Goods, people, and ideas flowed in and out continuously. Great Zimbabwe sat further inland, controlling the pipeline that fed that coastal highway. Together, these civilizations were not isolated backwaters. They were essential nodes in one of the most lucrative trade networks on the planet. Great Zimbabwe, stone, power, and the gold trade. Great Zimbabwe flourished roughly between 1100 and 1450 CE in what is today the modern nation of Zimbabwe. The name itself tells you something. Zimbabwe derives from a Shona phrase meaning great stone houses or venerated houses, and the ruins of the stone enclosures called Zimbabwe are genuinely awe-inspiring. The largest structure, the Great Enclosure, required an estimated 1 million granite blocks stacked without mortar. No mortar. That's a bit like building a skyscraper using only precise engineering and gravity. When European colonizers first encountered these ruins in the 19th century, many refused to believe Africans had built them, a racist assumption that the AP exam implicitly asks you to reject by understanding the sophistication of the civilization responsible. Great Zimbabwe was the political and ceremonial capital of the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which was ruled by a king known as the Mambo. This is your key political vocabulary for the exam. The Mambo's authority was reinforced by control over cattle, a major symbol of wealth and power in the region, and crucially over the gold trade. The region around Great Zimbabwe was extraordinarily rich in gold deposits, and the Mambo acted essentially as a monopoly gatekeeper. Think of it like controlling the only road in and out of a gold rush town. If merchants wanted access to the gold fields, they went through Great Zimbabwe's political structure. This connection between political authority and trade control is a recurring AP theme you'll see across Unit 1 and beyond, from the Mongols taxing Silk Road merchants to Mali's kings controlling trans-Saharan gold routes. That gold didn't just stay local. Archaeological evidence at Great Zimbabwe includes Chinese porcelain, Persian ceramics, and glass beads from the Indian Ocean world, which tells you directly that this inland civilization was deeply plugged into long-distance trade for the AP exam. Remember that trade goods flowing into Zimbabwe, luxury manufactured goods, and trade goods flowing out, gold and ivory, represent a classic exchange dynamic. Zimbabwe supplied raw materials. Indian Ocean merchants supplied finished luxury goods. Sound familiar? It should, because this pattern echoes across world history from ancient times through the colonial era. Kilwa and the Swahili coast city-states, where Africa met the ocean. Now slide eastward to the coast. The Swahili coast city-states, including Kilwa, Mombasa, Sofala, and Zanzibar, formed a string of prosperous, culturally hybrid trading ports along the East African coast, peaking roughly between 1000 and 1500 CE. Kilwa, located on a small island off the coast of modern Tanzania, was arguably the most powerful of these. The 14th century Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa and described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world. When a seasoned world traveler calls your city one of the best he's ever seen, you know something impressive is happening there. What made Kilwa so powerful was its position as the dominant broker in the coastal trade network. Gold from Great Zimbabwe traveled overland to coastal ports like Sofala, then moved northward up the coast to Kilwa, which controlled the redistribution of that gold to Indian Ocean merchants. Kilwa essentially taxed every shipment passing through, which generated enormous revenue. The city's famous Husuni Kubwa Palace, one of the largest buildings in sub-Saharan Africa at the time, was built from coral stone and reflected the city's extraordinary wealth. The Swahili culture itself is a perfect exam illustration of cultural synthesis, a concept College Board loves. Swahili comes from an Arabic word meaning of the coast, and the culture blended Bantu African traditions with Arab, Persian, and Indian influences. The result was a unique language, Kiswahili, a predominantly Muslim religious identity adopted through trade contact rather than conquest, and an architectural style that fused African and Islamic forms. This synthesis is not Africans becoming Arab, a common misconception you need to actively avoid on the exam. It is Africans selectively incorporating outside influences while maintaining distinct local identities and political structures. The city-states were governed by local Swahili rulers, not by Arab or Persian outsiders. AP exam traps and connections to watch for. Here's where students lose points. The most common trap is attributing Swahili coast prosperity entirely to Arab or Persian merchants, as if Africans were passive recipients of outside development. Wrong. Local Swahili rulers actively managed trade, collected taxes, and built political institutions. Agency matters on the AP exam. College Board's rubrics reward you for recognizing who is driving change and exercising power. A second trap involves chronology. Great Zimbabwe's decline by around 1450 CE overlaps with the rise of the Portuguese on the East African coast in the early 1500s. Do not conflate these two things as cause and effect without nuance. Zimbabwe's decline had internal causes, possible environmental degradation, shifting trade routes, while the Portuguese arrival disrupted the Swahili city-states somewhat later. The College Board will sometimes offer answer choices that collapse this timeline, and you need to distinguish them. For FRQ scoring, when you discuss either civilization, you must address at least two of these three dimensions to earn argument complexity points: political organization, the Mambo's authority, or Swahili rulers; economic function, gold and ivory trade, Indian Ocean commerce; and cultural exchange, synthesis of African, Arab, and Asian influences. Hit all three, and you're demonstrating the kind of cross-dimensional thinking that earns the highest scores. These civilizations also connect directly to Unit 2's coverage of Indian Ocean networks, and they reappear implicitly when Unit 4 addresses the disruptions caused by European maritime expansion. The Portuguese didn't enter an empty ocean. They muscled into a sophisticated, centuries-old system that was already thriving without them. Speaking of those Indian Ocean networks, let's now turn to the broader web of sea-based commerce that connected all these civilizations together, examining how monsoon winds became the engine of interconnection across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. 1.5c. The role of the Indian Ocean and Trans-Saharan trade networks in African state building. Let's talk about power, not the kind that comes from an army storming a city, but the kind that comes from sitting at the right crossroads at the right time. That's really the story of African state building between roughly 1200 and 1450 CE, the period the AP exam cares most about here. Two great trade systems, the Indian Ocean network and the Trans-Saharan routes, acted like economic rivers flowing through the continent, and the states that grew up along their banks became some of the wealthiest and most sophisticated polities in the medieval world. The Trans-Saharan network and West African empires. Picture the Sahara Desert not as a barrier, which is how most students instinctively see it, but as an ocean of sand with ports. The camels that crossed it starting around 300 CE were functionally ships. This is the single most important reframe for the AP exam, and it shows up constantly in document-based questions. The Sahara connected, it did not divide. The introduction of the camel transformed what had been an impassable obstacle into a highway, and the states that sat at the northern and southern edges of that highway became extraordinarily powerful. The big example here is the Mali Empire, and specifically Mansa Musa, whose 1324 pilgrimage to Mecca is one of the most iconic data points in AP world history. Here's why it matters beyond the wow factor. Mansa Musa traveled with an entourage estimated at 60,000 people and so much gold that he allegedly caused inflation in Cairo and the Mediterranean for over a decade afterward. That image, a single ruler carrying enough wealth to destabilize regional economies, tells you everything about how trans-Saharan trade worked. Mali sat between the goldfields of West Africa and the North African and Middle Eastern merchants who desperately wanted that gold. Mali controlled the supply, the merchants controlled the demand, and the state extracted wealth from both sides through taxation of trade passing through its territory. This taxation model is what the College Board calls taxing trade, and it is the core mechanism you need to explain for any FRQ asking how African states accumulated wealth before Mali. There was Ghana, and here is a trap that appears on MCQs constantly. The modern nation of Ghana is not in the same location as the ancient empire of Ghana. The medieval Ghana Empire sat further north and west, in what is today parts of Mauritania and Mali. Students who confuse the geography consistently lose points. The Ghana Empire controlled the gold-salt trade, which deserves its own moment of explanation because it is so fundamental. Salt from the Sahara was just as valuable as gold from the south, in some contexts, literally pound-for-pound equivalent in price. Salt preserved food and was biologically essential. Gold was liquid wealth. Ghana acted as the middleman, sitting between the two commodities and profiting from their exchange. After Mali came Songhai, which you should know reached its peak under Askia Muhammad in the late 1400s and early 1500s, extending the same taxing trade model. Islam traveled along these same trade routes, and this is a connection the AP exam loves. As Muslim merchants moved through the Sahara, they brought their faith, their literacy in Arabic, and their administrative technique. West African rulers like Mansa Musa converted to Islam, not necessarily because of deep religious transformation, but because conversion was strategically brilliant. It gave them access to a vast Islamic trading network, legitimized their authority in the eyes of Muslim merchants and scholars, and provided a literate class of administrators who could keep records. Timbuktu became a major center of Islamic scholarship precisely because it sat at a trade node. When the AP exam asks you to explain the spread of Islam, always connect it to the commercial networks first. The Indian Ocean Network and East African city-states. Now shift your mental map to the eastern coast of Africa. The Indian Ocean Trade Network was arguably the most sophisticated commercial system in the pre-Columbian world, and East Africa was fully integrated into it. The mechanism here is the monsoon winds, a seasonal wind system that reverses direction twice a year, blowing northeast from October to April and southwest from May to September. Think of monsoons as a natural scheduling system. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and eventually China could ride the winds to East Africa in one season and sail home in the next. This made regular, predictable, long-distance trade possible centuries before European navigation techniques existed. The East African city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Zanzibar, Sofala, grew wealthy by exporting gold, ivory, enslaved people, and animal skins, and importing porcelain, textiles, and manufactured goods from South Asia and China. Kilwa, on what is today the Tanzanian coast, is the prime example the AP exam returns to repeatedly. Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa in the 133-30s and described it as one of the most beautiful cities in the world, high praise from a man who had visited virtually every major urban center on the planet. Kilwa's prosperity came from its control of the gold trade coming up from the interior through the Swahili coast. The Swahili culture itself, a blend of Bantu African and Arab Persian influences, is the College Board's go-to example of cultural synthesis produced by Indian Ocean trade. When you see an FRQ asking about cross-cultural exchange in the Indian Ocean, Swahili language, architecture, and the presence of Chinese porcelain in East African archaeological sites are your best evidence. Great Zimbabwe, while it sits inland rather than on the coast, belongs in this conversation because it controlled the gold flowing to the coast that made Kilwa rich. If you see Great Zimbabwe on the exam, explain it as part of the Indian Ocean Network's interior extension, not as an isolated phenomenon. Connecting it all for the exam. A few technical precision points to lock in before you move on. First, the College Board distinguishes between the mechanisms of state building, tribute, taxation of trade, and control of key commodities. Make sure your FRQ responses use these terms precisely and explain the causal chain. Controlling trade routes led to wealth accumulation, which funded armies and bureaucracies, which consolidated state power. Second, do not describe African states as passive recipients of outside influence. Both the Trans-Saharan and Indian Ocean networks show African rulers actively choosing which outside elements to adopt, which to adapt, and which to refuse. That's agency, and the exam rewards you for demonstrating it. Third, the connections across units are significant. This topic reappears when you study the silver trade in Unit 4, European contact with Africa in Unit 4 and 5, and colonialism in Unit 6. So the economic logic you learn here pays dividends throughout the course. With African state building firmly in your understanding, you're ready to step further into the network that made all of this possible. The full scope of the Indian Ocean trade system, which we'll explore in the next section. 1.5D Diversity of African political structures, kingdoms, city-states, and stateless societies. Setting the stage, why African political diversity matters. Let's start with something that might seem obvious once you hear it, but is absolutely crucial for your AP exam. Africa in the period 1114-50 CE was not a monolith. It was not one empire, one culture, or one political system. It was, and this is the phrase College Board loves, a continent of remarkable political diversity. When you see a question asking you to generalize about African political organization, the correct answer almost always involves acknowledging that diversity. If a multiple-choice option says something like Africa was primarily organized into centralized kingdoms, hit the brakes. That's a trap. Africa had kingdoms, yes, but also city-states and stateless societies, and all three operated simultaneously, often in the same geographic neighborhood. Think of it this way. Imagine you're looking at a map of medieval Europe, and you see the Holy Roman Empire, the Italian city-states of Florence and Venice, and small tribal confederacies in Scandinavia, all existing at the same time. Africa's political landscape was similarly layered and complex, except it was operating across a continent far larger than Europe, with far more ecological and cultural variation driving those differences. Centralized kingdoms. Power from the top down. The centralized kingdoms are probably the most familiar to you, and they're definitely the most heavily tested. When College Board talks about sub-Saharan African kingdoms in this period, the three you absolutely must know are Mali, Great Zimbabwe, and the kingdoms of the East African coast, which often intersect with the city-state category, so we'll revisit those. Mali is your anchor example here. Under Mansa Musa in the early 14th century, Mali was one of the wealthiest and most powerful states in the entire world. Not just in Africa, the whole world. The kingdom derived its political authority from control over trans-Saharan trade routes, particularly the gold-salt exchange. Here's the key structural point for the exam. Mali's political power was centralized, but also delegated. The Mansa sat at the top, but provincial governors called Ferrari administered regions. This is a classic feature of large pre-industrial kingdoms. You simply cannot run a massive territory from one throne room, so you build a hierarchy. When an FRQ asks you to describe how kingdoms maintain control over large territories, this is your evidence: hierarchical administration, military power, and control of economic resources. Great Zimbabwe is your second anchor. Located in present-day Zimbabwe, this kingdom was built around cattle wealth and long-distance trade, particularly with East African coastal traders who connected Zimbabwe to Indian Ocean commerce. The stone enclosures, Zimbabwes, were not just impressive architecture, they were symbols of political authority. The ruler, the Mambo, derived legitimacy partly from spiritual roles connecting him to ancestors and divine authority. For the AP exam, remember that political authority in African kingdoms was often intertwined with religious or spiritual legitimacy. This is a pattern you'll see across Mali, Islam and kingship, Great Zimbabwe, ancestor veneration, and beyond. City-states, the merchant republics of East Africa. Now let's pivot to city-states, and for this you need the Swahili coast firmly in your mind. Cities like Kilwa, Mombasa, and Zanzibar were not ruled by great inland empires. They were relatively self-governing commercial centers, city-states, whose power came from their position as middlemen in the Indian Ocean trade network. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, India, and China all passed through these ports, and the local Swahili elites grew extraordinarily wealthy, facilitating that exchange. Here's a clarifying analogy. Think of the Swahili city-states the way you'd think of Venice or Genoa in medieval Europe: independent, commercially oriented, politically autonomous, and deeply cosmopolitan. They weren't satellites of a larger empire, they were hubs in their own right. The big conceptual point for your exam is this: city-states derive their political power primarily from trade and commerce rather than territorial conquest or agricultural surplus. This distinguishes them clearly from the large kingdoms, and it's a distinction that shows up in both MCQs and document-based questions. When you see a document describing an East African coastal ruler negotiating trade agreements or collecting customs duties, you're looking at city-state governance in action. Stateless societies. Order without a king. Here's where students lose points every single year because stateless societies are the hardest concept to wrap your head around. The name sounds almost anarchic, no state, so chaos, but that's exactly the wrong interpretation. Stateless societies were organized, functional communities. They simply governed themselves without a centralized authority like a king bureaucracy or formal state apparatus. Think of stateless societies the way you might think of a neighborhood governed entirely by community norms, family networks, and respected elders. No mayor, no city council, but still orderly and coherent. In the African context, groups like the Igbo of West Africa govern themselves through councils of elders, age-grade associations, groups of people who came of age together and shared civic responsibilities, and lineage systems in which family networks provided the structure for resolving disputes and making collective decisions. For the AP exam, the critical thing to understand is that stateless societies were not primitive or underdeveloped versions of kingdoms. They were different political adaptations suited to different environments and circumstances. College Board will sometimes include a source describing a community with no single ruler, and the trap answer will be to call it chaotic or lacking political organization. The correct interpretation is that it represents decentralized political organization, a legitimate and sophisticated system. Don't fall into the hierarchy equals civilization trap. That's one of the most common MCQ wrong answer traps in this entire unit. Connecting to the bigger picture, here's how this all threads through the rest of your AP course. The political diversity of Africa directly shaped how the continent interacted with the broader world. Kingdoms like Mali participated in trans-Saharan trade and facilitated the spread of Islam across West Africa. Connections you'll need for Unit 1 and Unit 2. The Swahili city-states plugged Africa into the Indian Ocean network, a major focus of Unit 2. And in Units 3 through 5, when you study European contact and eventually the Atlantic slave trade, understanding African political structures helps you analyze why the slave trade unfolded differently in different regions. Centralized kingdoms sometimes traded enslaved people, while stateless societies were often more vulnerable to raiding. The core takeaway College Board wants you to carry is this: diversity is the answer, not uniformity. Africa's kingdoms, city-states, and stateless societies each represented coherent, adapted responses to local conditions of geography, ecology, religion, and trade, and that complexity is exactly what the exam rewards you for recognizing. Coming up next, we'll zoom in on the Indian Ocean world and examine how maritime trade networks wove together East Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia into one of history's most dynamic commercial systems. 1.6 Developments in Europe from c. 1200 to c. 1450. Setting the stage, Europe in the medieval world. Let's talk about Europe, but not the Europe you might be picturing. Forget Renaissance paintings and globe-trotting explorers. The Europe of 1200 to 1450 is a place that most of the world frankly didn't think much about. China had the Song Dynasty. The Islamic world had thriving trade networks and universities. And Europe was, by comparison, a patchwork of feudal kingdoms, deeply religious, largely agricultural, and slowly, very slowly, beginning to reconnect with the wider world. Understanding this context is absolutely essential for the AP exam, because College Board loves to test whether you can place Europe in its global position rather than treating it as the center of the story. In this era, it isn't. Feudalism and the medieval order. The organizing principle of European society during this period is feudalism, a decentralized system of political and economic relationships built on land and loyalty. Think of it like a franchise arrangement. The king is the corporate headquarters. He grants land, called a fief, to lords and nobles in exchange for military service and political loyalty. Those lords then subgrant land to lesser knights, who extract labor and goods from peasants called serfs. The serfs are at the bottom, tied to the land, unable to leave without permission. This is manorialism, the economic engine of feudalism, where the manor, a self-sufficient agricultural estate, produces everything from food to iron tools locally, with very little need for long-distance trade. Here's the AP trap to watch. Feudalism is a political structure, while manorialism is the economic system underneath it. The exam will sometimes describe one and ask you to name the other. Don't swap them. They're two sides of the same coin, but they're not the same coin. The role of the Catholic Church. If feudalism is the skeleton of medieval Europe, the Catholic Church is the nervous system. During this period, the Church is the single most powerful and unifying institution across a fragmented continent. It controls education through cathedral schools and early universities like Bologna and Paris. It controls spiritual life, and because people genuinely believed that eternal salvation depended on the Church's sacraments, the threat of excommunication was politically devastating. Kings needed the Church's blessing to legitimize their rule, and the Church sometimes wielded that power aggressively, as in the long conflict between popes and Holy Roman emperors over who had the right to appoint bishops, a dispute historians call the investiture controversy. For the AP exam, remember this key dynamic: the Church provided cultural unity in a politically fragmented Europe. That's a pattern College Board returns to repeatedly. When you see a question asking what held medieval Europe together despite the lack of centralized political authority, the answer is the Roman Catholic Church. The Crusades and contact with the wider world. Now here's where Europe starts poking its head into the broader global tapestry. Beginning in 1095 and continuing through the 1200s and beyond, European knights launched a series of military campaigns called the Crusades, aimed at recapturing Jerusalem and the Holy Land from Muslim control. And while the Crusades were largely a military failure, the Crusader states were temporary, and Jerusalem ultimately remained under Muslim control. Their long-term consequences for Europe were enormous. Think of the Crusades as Europe's awkward first date with the wider world. European soldiers and merchants came into contact with Islamic scholarship, luxury goods, and trade networks that made Europe's own economy look primitive by comparison. Spices, silk, glassware, philosophical texts, these flowed back to Europe and created appetite. That appetite would eventually drive the commercial revolution, and centuries later, the age of exploration. The AP exam loves this cause and effect chain. When you see a question about what stimulated European interest in trade and exploration, the Crusades are part of the origin story. The Black Death and its transformative effects. If the Crusades opened Europe's eyes, the Black Death, which swept across Europe beginning in 1347, turned the entire world upside down. Carried along the Silk Roads by Mongol trade networks and transmitted by fleas on rats, the bubonic plague killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in just a few years. Some regions lost half their people. Entire villages vanished. Here's why this matters enormously for the AP exam. The Black Death is a turning point, and College Board uses turning points to test causation. The massive labor shortage that followed the plague gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining power. Serfdom weakened across Western Europe as lords had to offer wages and better conditions to attract workers. This accelerated the decline of feudalism. Meanwhile, the Church's failure to explain or prevent the plague deeply damaged its spiritual authority, laying psychological groundwork for later reform movements. And the demand for trade goods that helped spread the plague in the first place, that same interconnected Silk Road network, shows you how global this supposedly local European disaster really was. The revival of trade and towns. Running parallel to all of this is a gradual but significant commercial revival. Between roughly 1000 and 1400, European towns began to grow again after centuries of decline following Rome's fall. Trade fairs in Champagne, France became international marketplaces. Italian city-states like Venice and Genoa positioned themselves as middlemen between the Islamic world and European consumers, growing fabulously wealthy in the process. This merchant class, the bourgeoisie, didn't fit neatly into the feudal hierarchy, and their growing wealth and power slowly eroded the old order. A common MCQ trap here: don't confuse the commercial revival with full capitalism or industrialization. Europe in 1450 has proto-capitalist features, markets, credit, profit-seeking, but it is not yet an industrial or fully market-integrated economy. Watch the language carefully on the exam. Connecting forward and outward. On the AP exam, always think of 1100 to 1450 Europe as a before picture, before the Renaissance fully bloomed, before the Reformation, before Columbus. The developments in this period, weakening feudalism, a challenged church, rising merchant wealth, exposure to global goods through the Crusades and Mongol trade networks, are the seeds of everything that comes in Units 3, 4, and 5. When you understand medieval Europe not as isolated backwardness, but as a slow-building pressure system, the explosion of European power after 1450 makes complete sense. With that foundation firmly in place, let's turn next to the cross-cultural trade networks that were quietly connecting and reshaping the entire world during the same era. 1.6a Feudalism and Manorialism as Political and Economic Systems. Let's talk about two systems that basically ran medieval Europe, and two systems that the AP exam loves to test together, because students constantly mix them up. Think of feudalism and manorialism as two sides of the same coin. One is about political power, and one is about economic survival. Once you lock that distinction in your head, everything else falls into place. Feudalism, the political pyramid. Imagine you're a king in medieval Europe, maybe around the 9th or 10th century. You've got a massive kingdom to defend, but you can't be everywhere at once. You don't have a professional army on salary, and you certainly don't have the tax infrastructure to pay for one. What do? You make deals. You grant parcels of land, called fiefs, to powerful nobles called lords or vassals, and in exchange they promise you military service and loyalty. That's feudalism in its essence, a political and military system built on reciprocal obligations tied to land. The AP exam wants you to think of feudalism as a hierarchy. At the top sits the monarch, below are the great nobles, dukes, counts, earls, who hold large fiefs directly from the king. Those nobles then turn around and grant smaller fiefs to lesser knights, who become their vassals. The relationship is formalized through a ceremony called un homage and fealty, where the vassal kneels, places his hands in his lord's hands, and swears loyalty. The lord in return promises protection and justice. This is a personal bond, and that word personal matters enormously for the exam, because it distinguishes European feudalism from more bureaucratic state systems you'll study in China or the Islamic caliphates. The key term College Board uses here is decentralized political authority. Feudalism emerged precisely because centralized state power had fragmented. Think the collapse of the Carolingian Empire after Charlemagne's death, or the waves of Viking, Magyar, and Saracen invasions that left local populations desperate for local protection. No one could wait for a distant king when raiders were burning their village. So power devolved downward, and the lord of your local castle became the most important political figure in your life. Manorialism, the economic engine. Now, feudalism tells you who holds political power. Manorialism tells you how that society feeds itself and generates wealth. The manor is the lord's estate. Picture a self-sufficient agricultural community, usually a village clustered around a fortified house or small castle, surrounded by fields, a mill, a church, and a forest. The manor is the basic economic unit of medieval European life. Here's the analogy I love. Think of the manor like a franchise. The lord owns the store, the land, the mill, the oven, the wine press. The serfs, also called villeins, are the workers who live on that land. They are not technically slaves. They cannot be bought and sold apart from the land, but they are bound to it. They cannot leave without the lord's permission, in exchange for being allowed to farm strips of land for their own subsistence. Serfs owe the lord labor services, typically working his fields a certain number of days per week. They also owe dues, payments in grain, livestock, or eventually money, plus fees for using the mill or the oven, facilities they couldn't function without. This creates a system of coerced labor, and the AP exam will ask you to compare this explicitly to other forms of coerced labor across the globe, slavery in various forms, the Mita system in the Inca Empire, debt bondage in South and Southeast Asia. The critical distinction is that serfdom ties the person to the land, not to an owner as personal property. When you're writing an FRQ comparing labor systems, that nuance can earn you a point. The vocabulary you must know College Board uses precise language, so you need to use it too. The lord-vassal relationship describes the political bond between nobles. The lord-serf relationship describes the economic bond at the base of the manor. Fief refers to the land grant. Homage and fealty is the ceremony of loyalty. Serfdom is the condition of bound agricultural laborers. Demesne, pronounced demien, is the portion of the manor the lord farms directly for himself, using serf labor. These terms show up in both multiple choice and the DBQ or LEQ rubrics. Common exam traps to avoid. The single biggest trap on the AP exam is treating feudalism and manorialism as the same thing. They are not. If an exam question asks about the political structure of medieval Europe, you're talking about feudalism and the lord-vassal hierarchy. If it asks about the economic organization or agricultural production, you're talking about manorialism and the lord-serf relationship. A second major trap is assuming feudalism was uniform and stable. In reality, it was messy, regional, and constantly contested. Vassals regularly ignored their obligations, and the system functioned differently in France, England, Germany, and Japan. The AP exam may ask you to compare European feudalism to Japanese feudalism, which developed independently and offers a striking parallel. Samurai as warrior vassals, daimyo as lords with similar reciprocal military obligations, yet embedded in a different cultural context. A third trap involves chronology. Feudalism didn't appear fully formed. It developed gradually from roughly the 9th through 11th centuries, and it began breaking down in the 12th and 13th centuries as centralized monarchies reasserted power, towns grew, and a cash economy slowly replaced payment in land and labor. By the time of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, serfdom in Western Europe was already weakening significantly, while ironically intensifying in Eastern Europe, a nuance that can appear in comparative FRQs. Connections across units. This topic connects directly forward in the course. In Unit 2, you'll study how the growth of trade networks and towns, the Commercial Revolution, gradually undermined manorialism as serfs could earn money and buy their freedom. In Unit 3, the Black Death's demographic catastrophe gave surviving serfs bargaining power, accelerating feudalism's decline in the West. When you get to Unit 4 and the Columbian Exchange, European landowners in the Americas will attempt to recreate manorial-style coerced labor through the encomienda system, drawing a direct institutional line from medieval Europe to the New World. And throughout the course, whenever College Board asks you to analyze how political structures relate to economic systems, feudalism and manorialism are your anchor example of how the two can be deeply intertwined yet conceptually distinct. Coming up next, we're going to cross continents and look at the Song Dynasty in China, a civilization that, in fascinating contrast to fragmented feudal Europe, maintained one of the most sophisticated, centralized bureaucracies the pre-modern world had ever seen. 1.6b, the Roman Catholic Church, political authority, the Crusades, and cultural influence. The Church as a political superpower. Let's start with an analogy that might surprise you. Imagine if Google, a private corporation, could tell the President of the United States what to do, override his decisions, and even fire him if they disagreed. Sounds wild, right? That's roughly the kind of power the Roman Catholic Church wielded in medieval Europe, and understanding why that was possible is the foundation for everything else in this section. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Europe fragmented into dozens of small, unstable kingdoms. Kings came and went, armies won and lost, but the Church remained. It had institutional continuity, a unified language in Latin, a literate clergy when almost nobody else could read, and crucially control over something every medieval European cared about deeply, their eternal soul. The Church didn't just offer spiritual guidance, it claimed the exclusive power to determine whether you went to heaven or hell. That gave it leverage no army could match. The concept you absolutely need to know here is the lay investiture controversy. Kings and lords wanted to appoint church officials, bishops and abbots, because those officials controlled enormous amounts of land and wealth. The Church said no. That was their job. This conflict peaked in the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries, culminating in the dramatic Walk to Canossa in 1077. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV literally stood barefoot in the snow for 3 days outside Pope Gregory VII's castle, begging for forgiveness after Gregory had excommunicated him. Excommunication meant being cut off from the Church's sacraments, no baptism for your children, no last rites when you died, and your subjects were released from their oaths of loyalty to you. It was a political nuclear weapon. The eventual compromise, the Concordat of Worms in 1022, established that the Church would handle spiritual appointments while secular rulers handled the political side. It was a draw, but the fact that a pope could bring an emperor to his knees in the snow tells you everything about the balance of power. For the AP exam, a common trap is to think of the Church's political power as purely religious. It wasn't. It was rooted in land ownership, administrative capacity, and the control of education. Monasteries were economic powerhouses. The clergy ran schools, hospitals, and diplomatic missions. When your essay prompt asks about political structures in the medieval period, the Church is not a background detail. It is a central actor in the political system, not separate from it. The Crusades, holy war with very unholy consequences. Now let's talk about the Crusades because they're one of the most misunderstood topics on the AP exam. Students often frame them as simply Christians fighting Muslims for Jerusalem, and while that's not wrong, it's dangerously incomplete for a 5. Think of the Crusades like a startup company that went public. The original pitch, Pope Urban II's speech at the Council of Clermont in 1095, was about recovering the Holy Land and reuniting with Eastern Christians after the Great Schism of 1054 had split Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox Christianity. But once the money and armies started moving, the mission got complicated fast. There were 9 major crusading expeditions between 1095 and 1272, and they had consequences far beyond the Holy Land. The AP exam loves asking about the second-order effects of the Crusades. First, they dramatically stimulated trade between Europe and the Islamic world. European crusaders encountered goods they'd never seen: spices, silk, sugar, advanced mathematics, and medical knowledge, and they wanted more. This helped spark the commercial revival that would eventually fuel the Renaissance. Second, the Crusades devastated Jewish communities in Europe as crusading mobs frequently massacred Jewish populations on their way east, a fact the College Board may ask you to connect to patterns of religious persecution. Third, the Crusades accelerated the decline of Byzantine power, particularly after the catastrophic Fourth Crusade of 1204, when Crusaders sacked Constantinople, a Christian city, instead of fighting Muslims. This weakened Byzantium so severely that it contributed to its eventual fall to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, which you'll revisit in Unit 3. A critical distinction for the exam: do not confuse the Reconquista with the Crusades proper. The Reconquista was the centuries-long Christian effort to reclaim the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rulers, concluding in 1492. It runs parallel to the Crusades, but is a separate event with its own significance for the later age of exploration. Columbus sailed the same year Ferdinand and Isabella completed the Reconquista, and connecting those dots impresses AP readers. Cultural influence: the Church as civilization builder. The Church's cultural influence was so vast it's easy to take for granted. Think about the universities of Oxford, Bologna, and Paris all emerged from cathedral schools. Gothic cathedrals themselves are an AP-relevant topic. Their construction required advances in mathematics and engineering, employed thousands, and served as community centers, art galleries, and symbols of civic pride all at once. The Church preserved and transmitted classical knowledge through monasteries while also synthesizing it with Christian theology, a process historians call scholasticism, associated with thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, who blended Aristotelian philosophy with Christian doctrine in ways that made the Church intellectually credible to educated elites. Don't overlook the standardizing role of the Church in a fragmented Europe. Latin as a common language of scholarship, a shared calendar built around Christian holidays, uniform legal principles derived from canon law. These created a degree of cultural unity across wildly different kingdoms. When you see an FRQ asking about factors that promoted cultural exchange or unity in Afro-Eurasia, medieval Europe's church-centered civilization absolutely belongs in that conversation. For FRQ scoring, remember that the College Board rewards complexity points when you show how the Church was simultaneously a unifying and a divisive force, unifying Europeans around shared doctrine and culture, but also sparking conflict with secular rulers, the Byzantine world, and non-Christian populations. That tension is your complexity argument. Connecting forward. The authority, wealth, and cultural dominance of the Roman Catholic Church in this period set the stage for the cracks that would eventually fracture it, the corruption, the abuses, and the intellectual challenges that produced the Protestant Reformation in Unit 4, so keep this foundation firmly in mind as we move through the course. 1.6c The Black Death and its demographic, economic, and social consequences. Let's talk about one of the most catastrophic events in human history, and one that College Board loves to test you on, because its ripple effects touched virtually every other unit in this course. The Black Death, which swept through Afro-Eurasia in the mid-14th century, wasn't just a tragedy. It was a civilizational earthquake that reshuffled the entire deck of medieval society. Understanding it deeply means understanding why the world of 1400 looked so radically different from the world of 1300. What was the Black Death, and where did it come from? The plague arrived in waves, with the most devastating hitting Europe between 130-47 and 130-51, though outbreaks continued for centuries. Historians believe the bacterium Yersinia pestis originated in Central Asia, likely in the steppe regions of modern-day Kyrgyzstan or nearby areas, and traveled westward along the very trade networks we discuss in 1.1 through 1.5. This is your first big connection to other parts of Unit 1. The Mongol Empire and the Silk Roads didn't just carry silk and spices, they carried disease. The Pax Mongolica, which made long-distance trade safer and faster, inadvertently became a superhighway for pathogens. Think of it like this: the more you connect the nodes of a network, the more efficiently everything travels through it, including things you don't want. The plague hit the Islamic world, the Byzantine Empire, and China as well. China's population may have dropped by roughly a third during the 14th century. The Middle East lost enormous portions of its urban population. Europe, though, saw some of the most concentrated mortality. Scholars estimate that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population died within just a few years. To put that in modern terms, imagine the United States losing every single person from New York, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, and every other major city, twice over, gone within a generation. Demographic consequences. The demographic collapse is the foundation for everything else, so you need it locked down. Europe's population didn't recover to pre-plague levels until roughly the 16th century. That's 200 years of demographic depression. The AP exam will sometimes ask you to identify the long-term recovery timeline, and students often underestimate it. The answer is not 50 years. It is not 100 years, 2 centuries. Why so slow? Recurring outbreaks. The plague didn't strike once and leave. It returned again and again throughout the late 14th and 15th centuries, cutting down new generations before populations could stabilize. Think of it like a wound that keeps reopening before it can scar over. This recurring pattern is an edge case that shows up on multiple choice questions. Be careful not to treat the Black Death as a single event. Economic consequences. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating, and where the AP exam often places its trickiest questions. You might expect a catastrophic population loss to cause economic collapse across the board, and in some ways it did. Agricultural output fell, trade networks were disrupted, entire villages were abandoned. But here's the counterintuitive twist that College Board loves to test. For the survivors, especially in the lower classes, conditions often improved. When you suddenly have a third to a half of the workforce gone, basic economics tells you that labor becomes scarce. Scarce labor means workers can demand higher wages. Lords who once held serfs in bondage under the feudal system suddenly needed those laborers desperately. Serfs began walking off manors, moving to towns, and negotiating for better terms. Wages rose across Western Europe. Real purchasing power for ordinary workers increased. This is sometimes called the Golden Age of the laborer, and it's a concept the AP exam tests directly. Connect this to what you know about feudalism from earlier in Unit 1. The manorial system was already under strain, but the Black Death accelerated its decline in Western Europe dramatically. If you're asked what weakened feudal obligations and serfdom in Western Europe, the Black Death is a central answer. One common wrong answer trap here is assuming these economic improvements were universal. They were not. In Eastern Europe, lords actually tightened their control over serfs in the aftermath of the plague, fearing the same labor flight that was happening in the West. This regional divergence, Western Europe moving toward wage labor while Eastern Europe doubled down on serfdom, is something College Board has asked about in FRQs. Know the contrast. Social and cultural consequences. The social consequences operated on several levels simultaneously. First, traditional authorities lost enormous credibility. The Church, which was supposed to provide both spiritual and practical guidance during crises, had no real answers for why God was allowing this to happen, and no medical solutions to offer. Priests died alongside peasants. When the institutions people trusted most failed them so visibly, doubt and dissent grew. This weakened church authority connects forward to Unit 1's discussion of intellectual and religious ferment, and even further forward to the Reformation in Unit 3. The seeds of questioning church authority were watered, in part, by the plague years. Second, new social anxieties generated scapegoating. Jewish communities across Europe were blamed for poisoning wells and causing the plague, leading to horrific massacres. The pogroms of the 14th century represent one of the ugliest chapters of medieval European history. This is a detail the AP exam has included in stimulus-based questions, and it illustrates a broader pattern you'll see throughout the course. Disasters often intensify persecution of marginalized communities. Third, the plague produced a psychological and cultural preoccupation with death, what historians call the danse macabre, or dance of death, that permeated art, literature, and religious expression for generations. This isn't just trivia. It helps explain the cultural climate that produced the Renaissance's renewed focus on human experience and secular life. Connecting to the AP exam for FRQ scoring purposes. When you make an argument about the Black Death, always tie your evidence to a category of change, demographic, economic, or social, and then explain the mechanism of change. Don't just say the plague killed many people and things changed. Say, the population collapse created a labor shortage, which gave surviving peasants bargaining power that accelerated the decline of feudal obligations. That causal chain is what earns you points. Also remember, the Black Death is frequently used in the AP exam as a connecting thread between the Mongol networks of 1.3 and 1.5 and the transformations of early modern Europe in Units 3 and 4. Whenever you see a question about how the Silk Roads had unintended consequences, or how demographic shifts reshaped labor systems, the Black Death is likely in the conversation. With the dust of the 14th century still settling in our minds, let's turn now to examine how the survivors of this catastrophe, the states, the merchants, the scholars, began rebuilding and reimagining their world, setting the stage for the transformations of early modern globalization. 1.6d. The Holy Roman Empire, monarchies, and the decentralized nature of European political authority. Let's talk about something that sounds simple on the surface, but is absolutely essential for your AP exam, the idea that medieval and early modern Europe was, politically speaking, a mess, and I mean that in the most fascinating way possible. Imagine you're trying to run a company, but instead of being the CEO with clear authority over everyone, you're more like a neighborhood association president. You have a title, you have prestige, but your neighbors, the ones with the actual houses and fences and dogs, they're the ones with real power. That is essentially the Holy Roman Empire in a nutshell, and it's the key to understanding European political decentralization in this period. The Holy Roman Empire, a name worth unpacking. Voltaire, the French philosopher, famously quipped that the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. That line is worth remembering not just because it's clever, but because it captures exactly what College Board wants you to understand. The Holy Roman Empire, which dominated Central Europe from roughly 962 CE through 1806, was a fragmented collection of kingdoms, duchies, city-states, bishoprics, and free cities loosely held together under an elected emperor. Notice that word elected. The emperor was chosen by a group of powerful princes called the electors, and this single fact tells you everything about how power worked here. Unlike the centralized dynastic monarchies that were slowly developing in places like France and England, the Holy Roman Empire never consolidated power in a single ruler. The emperor needed the cooperation of his princes to get anything done. This is what AP World History means when it talks about decentralized political authority, power distributed across many nobles, church officials, and local lords rather than concentrated at the top. Feudalism as the foundation. To fully grasp decentralization, you need to see it as the political expression of the feudal system. Feudalism, and College Board uses this term specifically, was a hierarchical arrangement of land and loyalty. A king granted land, called a fief, to powerful lords who swore oaths of loyalty and military service in return. Those lords then granted portions of land to lesser knights who did the same. It looked like a pyramid on paper, but in practice, local lords had enormous autonomy. They collected taxes, administered justice, and maintained armies within their own territories. The king was theoretically supreme, but practically dependent. Think of feudalism like a franchise system. The corporate headquarters, the king sets the general rules. But the individual franchise owners, the lords, run their own restaurants day to day, and the corporate office can't really walk in and fire someone without a fight. The Catholic Church, a second layer of authority. Here's a concept that trips up students constantly in medieval Europe. Political authority wasn't just divided among secular rulers. The Catholic Church held enormous independent power, and this created a rivalry that defined the era. The Pope claimed authority over spiritual matters, and since virtually everyone in Europe was Catholic, that was a lot of leverage. The classic example is the investiture controversy of the 11th and 12th centuries. Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII clashed over who had the right to appoint or invest church officials like bishops. Why did this matter politically? Because bishops controlled land, wealth, and local populations. The conflict ended with Henry doing penance in the snow at Canossa in 1077, a powerful image of a monarch humbling himself before church authority. For your exam, this moment illustrates that even emperors operated within limits set by competing power structures. Comparing across Europe. A spectrum of centralization. The AP exam loves to ask you to compare, so here's a framework to keep in your head. European monarchies in this period existed on a spectrum from decentralized to centralized. The Holy Roman Empire sits at the decentralized end. Meanwhile, France and England were gradually moving towards stronger royal authority, but even there, kings faced resistance from nobles and the church. The Magna Carta of 1215 in England, for example, was essentially the nobility forcing King John to acknowledge limits on royal power. Even strong monarchies were constrained. The critical distinction for multiple-choice questions is this: decentralization does not mean chaos. It means that authority was shared and negotiated. Local lords had legitimate, recognized power within their domains. This is different from a failed state. It was a functioning, if messy, system of distributed governance. Common exam traps to avoid. One of the most common wrong answer traps is assuming that a powerful king automatically means a centralized state. Watch for this carefully. A king could be personally powerful, militarily skilled, wealthy, respected, while still governing a politically decentralized realm where nobles retained significant local control. The two things are not the same. Another trap. Students often confuse the Holy Roman Empire with the earlier Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 CE. The Holy Roman Empire began centuries later and had no direct political continuity with Rome. It claimed Roman heritage symbolically and religiously, not institutionally. Don't let the word Roman fool you. Also, be careful not to treat feudalism as uniquely European. The AP course asks you to make comparisons, and similar decentralized land for loyalty arrangements appeared in Japan under the shogunate system and in parts of the Islamic world. Recognizing these parallels and differences is a classic FRQ move. Connections to other units. This topic connects forward in time more than students realize. The decentralized nature of European political authority in this period helps explain why the Protestant Reformation Unit 1.5 and beyond spread so effectively. Princes and local rulers used it as an opportunity to break from both the Pope and the Emperor, claiming religious and political independence simultaneously. It also sets the stage for Unit 3's discussions of state consolidation and absolutism, when rulers like Louis XIV of France deliberately dismantled noble power to build centralized bureaucracies. You cannot understand the rise of the absolute monarch without first understanding what they were reacting against, the medieval world of shared, fragmented power. For FRQ responses, always anchor your argument about European political authority to specific evidence. the investiture controversy, the Magna Carta, the structure of Holy Roman Empire elections. College Board wants claims supported by historically specific examples, not just general statements about weak kings. The decentralized, negotiated world of medieval European politics is fascinating precisely because it was so different from what came after. And as we turn next to the networks of trade and cultural exchange that connected this fragmented Europe to the wider world, you'll see how that political fragmentation shaped everything from merchant independence to the spread of ideas across continents. 1.6e The Byzantine Empire and its relationship to Western Europe and the Islamic world. The empire that refused to die. Let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine a company founded in ancient Rome that keeps operating for over 1,000 years after Rome itself collapses. It adapts its branding, shifts its headquarters east, speaks a different language, and outlasts every competitor until finally, in 1453, a new player shuts it down for good. That company is the Byzantine Empire, and understanding its story is essential for scoring a 5 on the AP exam. Here's the first thing to lock into your memory. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantines. That name was invented by Western European scholars centuries later. The people of this empire called themselves Romans, Romioi, and their empire the continuation of Rome. The College Board loves this distinction because it captures something profound about how continuity and change work in history. When you see a question about the Byzantine Empire on the exam, you're always thinking about a civilization defined by its dual identity, simultaneously ancient Roman and distinctly medieval Greek Orthodox. The Eastern Roman Empire survived the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE because it had geographic and economic advantages that the West lacked. Constantinople, founded by Emperor Constantine in 330 CE on the Bosporus Strait, sat at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Think of it as the New York City of the medieval world, a bottleneck through which trade between the Black Sea, the Mediterranean, and beyond had to pass. That location generated massive tax revenue, which funded walls, armies, and bureaucracies that kept the empire alive while Western Europe fragmented into small feudal kingdoms. Byzantium and the Islamic world. Competition, contact, and conversion. Now here's where things get interesting for your exam because the Byzantine-Islamic relationship is one of the most frequently tested topics in Unit 1. When Islam emerged in the Arabian Peninsula in the early 7th century and rapidly expanded under the Umayyad Caliphate, the Byzantine Empire was the first major power it collided with. The two civilizations fought for centuries over the same strategic territories, Syria, Egypt, North Africa, and Anatolia. But they also traded, exchanged ideas, and translated knowledge back and forth in ways that shaped both civilizations. A critical concept here is the idea of cultural transmission. The Islamic world preserved and built upon Greek philosophical and scientific texts, Aristotle, Galen, Ptolemy, many of which were originally translated through Byzantine scholars. Think of the Byzantines as a kind of intellectual bridge, connecting classical Greco-Roman learning to the Islamic Golden Age. When you see an FRQ asking you to explain how knowledge moved across cultural boundaries in this period, the Byzantine-Islamic exchange is one of your strongest examples. The Byzantine Empire also lost significant territory to the expanding Islamic caliphates. Egypt fell in 641 CE, Syria was absorbed, and Anatolia was gradually Turkified following the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, where Seljuk Turks decisively defeated Byzantine forces. This is an important cause and effect chain for the exam. Byzantine weakness after Manzikert, desperate appeals to Western Europe for military help. Pope Urban II caused the First Crusade in 1095. That's a direct line, and the College Board wants you to see it. Byzantium and Western Europe. Schism, Crusades, and cultural distance. The relationship between Byzantium and Western Europe is best understood as one of mutual suspicion punctuated by moments of uneasy cooperation. The Great Schism of 1054 CE formalized the split between the Roman Catholic Church in the West and the Eastern Orthodox Church centered in Constantinople. The theological differences, debates over papal authority, the nature of the Holy Spirit, and liturgical practices matter less for the AP exam than the political consequences. It meant that Western Europeans and Byzantines, despite both being Christian, increasingly viewed each other as rivals rather than partners. A common wrong answer trap on the MCQ section is assuming that because both civilizations were Christian, they naturally cooperated. That assumption will cost you points. The Fourth Crusade in 1204 is your corrective. Western Crusaders, many of them French and Venetian, sacked Constantinople itself instead of continuing to the Holy Land. They looted the city, established a short-lived Latin empire on Byzantine soil, and deepened the hatred between East and West. When the College Board asks about factors that weakened the Byzantine Empire, the Fourth Crusade is essential. It never fully recovered from that betrayal. At the same time, Byzantium transmitted enormous cultural wealth to Western Europe. Greek classical texts, Orthodox Christian theology, artistic styles like mosaics and icon painting, and sophisticated legal traditions all flowed westward. The Byzantine emphasis on Roman law influenced medieval European legal systems, and Byzantine artistic styles shaped early medieval European Christian art. So the relationship contains both hostility and profound cultural debt, the nuance the AP exam rewards. Key terms and concepts to lock in. For the exam, make sure you can deploy these terms with precision. Caesaropapism refers to the Byzantine system in which the emperor held authority over both political and religious matters, a stark contrast to Western Europe, where the Pope and secular rulers constantly competed for supremacy. This is a direct comparison the AP exam loves to test. Orthodox Christianity is not simply Christianity. It's a distinct tradition with different practices, authority structures, and cultural expressions. Constantinople is consistently the right answer whenever a question asks about trade routes connecting Europe and Asia in this period. The Byzantine Empire also matters for understanding the later Ottoman Empire, which you'll cover in Unit 3. The Ottomans conquered Constantinople in 1453, renamed it Istanbul, and explicitly positioned themselves as inheritors of both Roman and Islamic imperial traditions, another beautiful example of the continuity and change framework that runs through every AP World History unit. Connecting it all. When you approach an FRQ asking about cross-cultural interactions in the period 1100–1450, or a document-based question featuring a Byzantine source, ask yourself 3 questions. How does Byzantium connect to the Islamic world through trade and knowledge transfer? How does it differ from and interact with Western Europe through religious schism and the Crusades? And how does it eventually decline in ways that reshape Eurasia? If you can answer those 3 questions fluently, you're thinking at the analysis level the College Board is looking for. With Byzantium's story firmly in your mental map, you're ready to zoom out and look at the broader patterns of cross-cultural exchange across the medieval world, which is exactly what the next section explores as we turn to the Silk Roads and the extraordinary networks that connected civilizations from East Asia to the Mediterranean. 1.7 Comparison in the period from c. 100 to c. 1450. Why comparison is the heart of AP World History. All right, let's talk about one of the most powerful tools in your AP World History arsenal, comparison. Think of comparison like being a good travel writer. A great travel writer doesn't just describe Paris. They tell you how Paris feels different from Rome, what those 2 cities share, and what that contrast reveals about European culture more broadly. That's exactly what historians do, and that's exactly what College Board wants you to do on exam day. Section 1.7 is less about introducing new content and more about teaching you how to think across civilizations simultaneously, a skill that will pay dividends on every single FRQ you write. The period from roughly 1200 to 1450 is a spectacular sandbox for comparison because you have genuinely diverse state forms, religious systems, economic networks, and social hierarchies operating at the same time, often in surprising parallel. College Board is essentially saying, you've learned about all these civilizations separately, now prove you can hold them next to each other and draw meaningful conclusions. The big comparison framework. What, how, and so what? Here's the framework you need to internalize. Whenever you compare 2 or more societies, you're answering 3 questions. What is similar? What is different? And most critically, so what does that reveal? That third question is where most students lose points on the FRQ, College Board rubrics for the document-based question. And the long essay question always reward a historically defensible thesis that makes a claim going beyond simply noting that things are similar or different. Saying, Song China and the Abbasid Caliphate both had sophisticated bureaucracies earns you nothing on its own. Saying both societies used meritocratic or semi-meritocratic administrative systems to manage vast territories, which suggests that large, complex states across Eurasia independently developed similar governance solutions to the same logistical problem. That's a thesis. Notice how it explains why the similarity matters and gestures toward a broader historical argument. The most common MCQ trap here is the false equivalence. College Board loves to offer an answer choice that sounds comparative but actually conflates two very different things. For example, a question might suggest that Mongol rule in China and Mongol rule in Persia produced identical cultural outcomes, but they didn't. In China, the Mongols, Yuan Dynasty, largely kept Chinese administrative structures while restricting Chinese officials from top posts, whereas in Persia, the Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam and patronized Persian cultural traditions enthusiastically. Same empire, different adaptations. If you see an answer choice claiming that Mongol conquest had uniform effects across regions, that's almost certainly wrong. Key comparisons. You must know cold. Let's walk through the essential comparative pairings for this period, because these show up directly in both MCQs and FRQs. Start with Song China and the Abbasid Caliphate. Both were extraordinarily sophisticated urban civilizations with complex trade networks, paper money or credit instruments, and remarkable scientific and philosophical output. Both also experienced serious political fragmentation during this era. The Abbasid Caliphate had already become largely ceremonial by 1221 with real power held by regional sultanates, while Song China was squeezed into the south by the Jin dynasty before the Mongols finished the job. The comparison reveals something profound. Administrative and cultural brilliance does not insulate a civilization from military vulnerability, particularly against steppe nomadic powers. Next, consider European feudalism versus Japanese feudalism. This is a classic College Board comparison and a notorious student trap. Yes, both systems involved lords granting land in exchange for military service, and both produced a warrior class, knights in Europe, samurai in Japan, governed by elaborate codes of honor. But the differences matter enormously. European feudalism was theoretically bound by a universal church that claimed spiritual authority over secular rulers, creating constant tension between pope and king. Japanese feudalism had no equivalent centralizing religious institution with that kind of political muscle. Also, the Japanese emperor retained symbolic importance as a divine figure even while real power shifted to the shogun, a split between ritual authority and practical authority that has no clean European parallel. When you see an MCQ asking you to identify a key difference between these two systems, look for the role of religion in legitimizing or challenging political authority. Now think about sub-Saharan African kingdoms, particularly Mali and Great Zimbabwe compared to contemporary states elsewhere. Mali, under Mansa Musa, early 1300s, controlled trans-Saharan gold and salt trade routes, making it fabulously wealthy by any global standard. Its administrative structure blended Islamic legal and scholarly traditions with indigenous West African political customs, creating a hybrid that was distinctly West African, even while connected to a wider Islamic world. Great Zimbabwe, on the other hand, was a Bantu-speaking state whose power derived from controlling interior trade routes for gold and cattle, without significant Islamic influence. Comparing these two within Africa itself, not just Africa versus Eurasia, demonstrates the internal diversity of African political development, which College Board tests explicitly because students habitually treat Africa as monolithic. The Mongol Empire as a comparative case study. The Mongol Empire deserves special attention because it functions as a kind of natural experiment for historians. The Mongols conquered enormous swaths of Eurasia and then adapted differently in each region. In China, they became the Yuan Dynasty. In Persia and Iraq, they became the Ilkhanate, which converted to Islam. In Russia, they established the Golden Horde, demanding tribute while leaving Russian princes largely in place. This variation, same conquerors, different outcomes, is catnip for AP exam writers. The takeaway you need: context shapes outcomes. Mongol rulers were pragmatic. They adopted the religious, cultural, and administrative tools that helped them govern effectively in each region. Connecting to other units. This comparative skill doesn't live only in Unit 1, it runs through the entire course. In Unit 2, you'll compare how the Black Death affected Europe versus the Islamic world. In Units 4 and 5, you'll compare the effects of European colonialism in different regions. The comparison framework you build here is the intellectual infrastructure for everything that follows. FRQ scoring reminder. For the long essay question specifically, College Board awards a point for complexity, and one reliable path to that complexity point is a meaningful comparison within your essay, even if the prompt doesn't explicitly ask for one. If you're writing about economic development in the post-classical period, briefly noting how a pattern in one region differs from another region demonstrates sophisticated historical thinking. Now that you've got comparison locked in as a skill and you understand the major civilizations of this era side by side, we're ready to step into Unit 2, where we'll watch all of these carefully constructed worlds get shaken, sometimes shattered by the forces of cross-cultural encounter, pandemic, and the rise of new empires. 1.7a Political structures, monarchies, empires, city-states, and decentralized systems compared across regions. Let's talk about power, who has it, how they get it, and how they keep it. That's really what political structures are all about, and for AP World History Modern, this is foundational knowledge. Everything else you study, trade, religion, social hierarchies, cultural exchange, happens inside these political containers. So understanding them deeply isn't just one topic. It's the lens through which you interpret the entire course. What is a political structure, really? Think of a political structure as the operating system of a society. Just like your phone runs on software that determines what it can and can't do, a civilization runs on a political system that determines who makes decisions, who enforces them, and how power gets passed down. The College Board wants you to be able to compare these structures across regions and time periods. Not just identify them, but explain why they emerged, how they functioned, and what their strengths and weaknesses were. Monarchies, the classic model. A monarchy is a political system centered on a single hereditary ruler, a king, queen, emperor, or pharaoh, whose authority is usually justified by tradition, religion, or divine right. The key AP term here is divine right, the idea that a ruler's authority comes directly from a god or gods, making political obedience essentially a religious duty. You see this in medieval European kingdoms, in the Ottoman sultans who held both political and religious authority as caliphs, and in the Chinese emperors who ruled under the mandate of heaven, a critically important concept for this exam. The mandate of heaven is worth slowing down on because the College Board loves it. It's not just a Chinese version of divine right. It has a crucial built-in feedback mechanism. If a dynasty ruled justly, heaven approved, and the dynasty flourished. If rulers became corrupt or natural disasters struck, that was heaven withdrawing its mandate. This gave Chinese political culture a logic for rebellion and dynastic change that European divine right lacked. On the AP exam, students often confuse these two concepts by treating them as identical. They are not. The mandate of heaven legitimizes overthrow of a failing ruler. European divine right, in its purest form, does not. Empires. Scale changes everything. An empire takes the logic of monarchy and stretches it often violently across diverse peoples, languages, and geographies. The defining feature of an empire is that it incorporates and governs multiple distinct ethnic or cultural groups under a single centralized authority. Think of the Mongol Empire at its height, one ruling elite governing from China to Persia to Eastern Europe, each region with its own traditions and administrative adaptations. The AP exam frequently tests how empires manage diversity. The most successful empires developed what you might call a franchise model of governance. The Mongols, for instance, often kept local rulers in place as long as they paid tribute and maintained order, a system called indirect rule. The Romans, Ottomans, and Mongols all used variations of this approach. Compare this to direct rule, where the imperial center replaces local leadership with its own appointed governors, which Rome also used depending on the province. Being able to distinguish between direct and indirect control and to give regional examples of each is a skill that appears in both multiple-choice questions and the document-based question rubric. A common exam trap: students sometimes assume that larger empires were automatically more stable or successful. In reality, scale created enormous administrative challenges, distance, communication lag, and the cost of maintaining armies across vast territories made empires fragile. The collapse of the Han Dynasty, the fragmentation of the Mongol Empire into successor khanates, these are stories about the limits of imperial administration. City-states, small but mighty. Now zoom way back in. A city-state is a politically independent urban center that controls the surrounding agricultural territory, but does not govern a vast empire. The Italian city-states of the 1200s through 1500s, Venice, Florence, Genoa, Milan, are your go-to examples for AP World History Modern. These were not minor footnotes. Venice was a commercial empire in its own right, dominating Mediterranean trade routes and developing sophisticated banking and legal institutions that influenced the modern world. What makes city-states interesting for comparison purposes is that their small scale allowed for intense specialization and innovation. Without the burden of governing millions of diverse subjects, city-state governments could be nimble, though that didn't make them democratic by modern standards. Venice's oligarchic merchant republic and Florence's guild-based governance were still elite systems. The AP exam wants you to recognize that political structure and economic function are deeply connected. City-states thrived because of trade, and their political systems were often designed to protect commercial interests. Decentralized systems, when no one is clearly in charge. Here's where students often get confused, so pay close attention. A decentralized political system is one where authority is fragmented, distributed among local lords, chiefs, kinship networks, or religious institutions rather than concentrated in a single ruler or capital city. Feudal Europe is the textbook example. The king technically sat at the top, but real power belonged to regional lords who controlled land, armies, and peasants. The king needed those lords as much as they needed the king. Decentralized systems also appear in sub-Saharan Africa, where many societies organized around kinship clans, village councils, or age-grade societies rather than hierarchical states. The Swahili coast city-states had strong local governance connected to Indian Ocean trade, but no overarching imperial authority binding them together. In the Americas, the political landscape before European contact included everything from the highly centralized Aztec Empire to the decentralized confederate structure of the Haudenosaunee Iroquois Confederacy, where power was shared among member nations through consensus. The MCQ trap with decentralized systems is assuming they were weak or primitive. They weren't. They were adapted to their environments. A nomadic, pastoral society needs flexible, kin-based authority because a rigid imperial bureaucracy cannot function across constantly moving populations. Connecting to the bigger picture. Everything in this section connects forward through the course. When you study the Columbian Exchange in Unit 2, you'll need to understand how these political structures shaped which societies could project power across oceans. In Units 3 through 5, you'll trace how land-based empires like the Ottomans, Safavids, and Mughals competed and eventually collided with European maritime empires, and how those interactions challenged every political structure on this list. The FRQ rubric consistently rewards students who can not only identify a political structure, but explain how it shaped or was shaped by broader historical forces. With that foundation firmly in place, let's move into the cultural and intellectual traditions that developed within these political systems. Because rulers didn't just need armies and tax collectors, they needed ideas to justify their power, and that's where our next section begins. 1000.7b Economic Systems, Agriculture, Tribute, and Trade across regions. Let's talk money, or rather, let's talk about what came before money as we understand it today. When you think about economic systems in the period from roughly 1200 to 1450 CE, you're really asking a fundamental question. How did societies organize the production, distribution, and consumption of resources? The answer, it turns out, was never just one thing. It was a layered, interconnected web of agriculture, tribute, and trade, and the AP exam expects you to understand each layer and how they interacted. Agriculture as the foundation. Start with agriculture because everything else rests on it. Think of agriculture as the engine of the pre-modern world. Every empire you'll study in Unit 1, the Song Dynasty, the Abbasid Caliphate, the Mali Empire, the Byzantine Empire, was built on an agricultural surplus. That word surplus is doing enormous work here, so let's unpack it. A surplus means you're producing more food than your community immediately needs to survive. That leftover production is what makes everything else possible. Specialized craftspeople, standing armies, bureaucracies, cities, long-distance trade. No surplus, no civilization as we know it. Different regions developed different agricultural strategies. In East Asia, wet rice cultivation in river valleys like the Yangtze allowed for incredibly dense, productive farming, enough to support the Song Dynasty's population of roughly 100 million people, the largest in the world at the time. In West Africa, the Niger River Valley supported millet and sorghum production that underpinned the wealth of Mali in the Americas. The three sisters, maize, beans, and squash, created a sophisticated, mutually beneficial agricultural system long before European contact. The AP exam loves to test whether you can connect specific agricultural methods to specific regions and explain why those methods supported specific political structures. A common trap on the MCQ section is treating agriculture as a purely local affair. Don't fall into it. Agricultural surpluses didn't just stay home, they flowed outward through tribute systems and trade networks, which brings us to the next layer. Tribute systems, the economics of power. Tribute is one of those concepts that students often reduce to paying taxes. And while that's not wrong, it misses the deeper political and economic logic. Tribute was a mechanism by which a dominant power extracted resources, grain, labor, luxury goods, military service from subordinate populations. It was simultaneously an economic tool and a statement of political hierarchy. When you paid tribute, you were acknowledging who was on top. Think of it this way. Imagine you're a local ruler in the Mali Empire during the reign of Mansa Musa. You control a region with gold mines. The emperor doesn't physically haul the gold himself. You send it to him as tribute, and in return he provides military protection, legitimacy, and access to trans-Saharan trade networks. It's a transaction, but it's also a relationship of power made visible through economic exchange. Different empires ran their tribute systems in very different ways, and the exam will test these distinctions. The Aztec Triple Alliance, technically just outside the 1200 to 1450 window, but foundational for later units, extracted tribute in luxury goods and sacrificial victims. The Mongol Empire demanded tribute in silver and horses from conquered peoples, channeling enormous wealth into the Mongol court. The Chinese tributary system worked differently still. Foreign states sent diplomatic missions carrying goods, which the emperor then reciprocated with lavish gifts, making the whole thing look like generosity, while actually reinforcing Chinese supremacy. This is a critical distinction. The Chinese system was designed to look like gift exchange, not extraction, but functionally it served similar political purposes. For the FRQ scoring rubric, remember that a strong answer about tribute systems must address at least three things: what was being extracted, who was doing the extracting, and what the subordinate party received in return. That third element is what separates a sophisticated answer from a surface-level one. Trade networks, connecting the dots. Now we come to trade, and this is where Unit 1 really comes alive. The period from 1200 to 1450 was defined by long-distance trade networks that connected regions in ways that would have seemed almost miraculous to earlier generations. The three you absolutely must know for the AP exam are the Silk Roads, the Indian Ocean Trade Network, and the Trans-Saharan trade routes. Here's the conceptual model the College Board wants you to internalize. These trade networks didn't just move goods, they moved ideas, technologies, religions, and diseases. When Chinese silk moved westward along the Silk Roads, it didn't travel alone. It brought Buddhism into Central Asia, paper-making technology into the Islamic world, and eventually the Black Death into Europe. Trade was a vector for everything, which is why the AP exam constantly asks you to explain cultural and intellectual diffusion alongside the movement of commodities. A graph you should be able to describe and reconstruct is a simple trade flow diagram. Draw regions as nodes, circles, and connect them with arrows showing what moved in which direction. For the Indian Ocean Network, for instance, you'd show East Africa exporting gold and enslaved people, the Arabian Peninsula exporting horses and textiles, South Asia exporting cotton and spices, and Southeast Asia exporting spices, with arrows flowing in multiple directions and dhow ships powered by monsoon winds, making the whole system tick seasonally. That seasonal rhythm of the monsoons is an edge case the MCQ loves to test. Merchants didn't sail year-round. They planned voyages around the monsoon calendar, which shaped everything from port infrastructure to the settlement of diaspora merchant communities. The most common wrong answer trap involving trade is conflating merchant motivations with state motivations. Individual merchants sought profit, states sought revenue through taxes on trade, access to luxury goods that reinforced elite status, and strategic resources like horses and iron. These aren't the same thing, and an MCQ answer that treats them as identical will steer you wrong. Connecting the three systems, here's the synthesis point that will elevate your FRQ responses. Agriculture, tribute, and trade weren't separate systems. They were mutually reinforcing. Agricultural surpluses created the goods that flowed through tribute systems and trade networks. Tribute systems concentrated wealth in capitals and courts, which then funded long-distance trade expeditions and military campaigns that opened new trade routes. Trade revenues enriched states enough to invest in agricultural improvements and irrigation projects. You can draw this as a cycle. Agriculture feeds tribute. Tribute enables trade. Trade revenue funds agricultural expansion, round and round. This interconnection is also how you link Unit 1 to later units. In Unit 3, when the Black Death disrupts everything, you'll see how a disease spreading through trade networks collapses agricultural labor pools, undermines tribute collection, and reshapes the entire economic architecture you've just learned. Understanding 1.7b isn't just about 1,000 to 100 to 1,450. It's the foundation on which the rest of the course stands. As you move forward into 1.7c, you'll see how these economic systems created the conditions for religious and cultural exchange, because where goods flow, ideas follow. 1.7c Role of religion and belief systems in legitimizing political authority. Let's talk about one of the most powerful tools rulers have ever had at their disposal, and it doesn't involve armies, treasuries, or walls. It's the claim that the gods are on their side. Welcome to one of the most consistently tested concepts in AP World History Modern, the relationship between religion, belief systems, and political legitimacy. The core concept. What is political legitimacy? Before we dive in, let's get our vocabulary straight because the AP exam loves precise terminology. Legitimacy refers to the widely accepted right to rule. It's the reason people obey a ruler, not just out of fear, but out of genuine belief that the ruler deserves power. Think of it this way. A bouncer at a club has authority because the club gave it to him. But a king claiming divine appointment is saying something much bigger. He's saying the universe itself appointed him. That's a legitimacy claim that's almost impossible to argue with, and that's exactly why rulers across the world and across centuries kept reaching for it. The College Board wants you to understand that religion and belief systems functioned as technologies of power, tools that helped rulers establish, maintain, and justify their authority. And crucially, this wasn't unique to one civilization. It appeared across multiple regions simultaneously during the period 1214-50, which is the heart of Unit 1. The major examples you must know start with China and the Mandate of Heaven, Ming. This is arguably the most important example for the exam. Chinese emperors claimed that heaven, a moral cosmic force, granted them the right to rule conditional on governing justly. If a ruler was corrupt or natural disasters struck, that was interpreted as heaven withdrawing its mandate. Rebellions, floods, and famines weren't just political problems, they were cosmic signals. This concept is brilliant because it served two masters. It legitimized the emperor's power when things went well, but it also gave the people a framework for understanding why a dynasty could be overthrown. The Zhou used it to justify overthrowing the Shang. The Han used it against the Qin. You'll see it tested repeatedly because it's both a legitimizing and a destabilizing force depending on context, and that dual nature is a classic AP trap. Now pivot to the Islamic world. In the Abbasid Caliphate, political authority was fused with religious leadership through the institution of the Caliphate. The Caliph was understood as the successor to the Prophet Muhammad, not a prophet himself, but the guardian of the faith and the political ruler simultaneously. The ulama, the class of Islamic scholars, played a critical supporting role here. They validated rulers by issuing religious rulings and incorporating them into the legal religious framework of Sharia. Even when the caliphate weakened after the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258, rulers across the Islamic world, including the Delhi Sultanate in South Asia, continued claiming Islamic legitimacy to justify their rule over largely non-Muslim populations. In Europe, the Catholic Church provided legitimacy through a completely different but equally powerful mechanism. The Pope's ability to crown emperors, think Charlemagne in 800 CE, was a statement that secular power flowed through divine sanction. The concept of the divine right of kings would develop more formally later, but the underlying logic was already present. Rulers ruled because God willed it. When Pope Gregory VII clashed with Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in the investiture controversy, the whole conflict was fundamentally about who controlled the source of legitimacy. This is a great example to use in an FRQ because it shows religion actively shaping and constraining political authority. Don't neglect South and Southeast Asia. In Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms, rulers often presented themselves as chakravartins, wheel-turning monarchs who embodied cosmic order, or as earthly manifestations of deities like Vishnu. The Khmer Empire's Angkor Wat was quite literally built as a representation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain in Hindu cosmology, and the god-king Devaraja concept fused the ruler's identity with the divine. This is a boundary case that trips up students. The Devaraja concept isn't the same as claiming to be a god in the Western sense. It's more about the ruler serving as a divine conduit or representative. Keep that distinction sharp. Common MCQ traps and FRQ scoring points. Here's where students consistently lose points. The first major trap is assuming religion only supports rulers, but the AP exam will absolutely present scenarios where religious authority challenges political authority. The investiture controversy, the power of the ulama to delegitimize rulers, the use of the mandate of heaven to justify rebellions. All of these show religion as a check on power, not just a blank endorsement. When you see an MCQ asking about the relationship between religion and political authority, don't automatically assume the relationship is supportive. The second trap is conflating theocracy with religious legitimacy. Not every government where religion plays a legitimizing role is a theocracy. The Abbasid Caliphate blended them, but a Song Dynasty emperor using Confucian ritual to legitimate his rule while governing through a secular bureaucracy is using belief systems for legitimacy without being a theocrat. Confucianism is a belief system, not a religion in the traditional Western sense, and it absolutely belongs in this conversation. Confucian ideas about the virtuous ruler, filial piety, and the hierarchical social order all function to legitimize political authority just as powerfully as divine appointment claims did. For FRQ responses, the scoring rubric rewards complexity. Don't just say rulers used religion to justify their power. You need to show how, through specific practices like coronation rituals, temple construction, religious legal systems, or court ceremonies, and you need to acknowledge that this relationship was dynamic and sometimes contentious. A top-scoring FRQ argument might note that religious legitimacy was most powerful when it was institutionalized, when there were priests, scholars, or clergy whose professional role was to validate the ruler's divine mandate. Connections to other units. This topic doesn't live in isolation. In Unit 2, you'll see how cross-cultural trade networks spread religions like Islam and Buddhism into new regions, which then created new legitimacy frameworks for rulers who converted. In Unit 3, the Protestant Reformation fundamentally disrupted Catholic-based political legitimacy in Europe. In Unit 4 and beyond, European colonizers used Christian missionary work partly as a tool to undermine indigenous political legitimacy structures. And in Unit 6, you'll see nationalist movements deliberately replace religious legitimacy with secular ideologies, which only makes sense once you understand how central religious legitimacy was in the first place. The through line is this: whoever controls the source of legitimacy controls who gets to rule. In the period 1200 to 1450, that source was almost always sacred, and understanding the specific mechanisms in each civilization is your ticket to a 5. Up next, we'll zoom out even further and look at how these political systems, legitimized by religion, structured by hierarchy, organized the movement of people, goods, and ideas across the remarkable trade networks of the medieval world. 1.7d Comparative Social Hierarchies and the Role of Gender Across Regions. Let's talk about power, not just who had it, but how societies organized it. And here's the thing that makes this topic so fascinating and so important for your AP exam. Every society we study in Unit 1 had a social hierarchy, but they didn't all build those hierarchies the same way. Think of it like different architects designing buildings for the same purpose. They all need load-bearing walls, but the materials, the blueprints, and the aesthetics vary enormously. That's exactly what's happening when you compare social structures across the civilizations of the period, roughly 1200 to 1450 CE. The big framework. What is a social hierarchy? A social hierarchy is a ranked system that determines who gets access to resources, power, status, and opportunity. Every civilization you'll encounter on the AP exam has one. The AP exam is going to ask you to compare these systems, so your job isn't just to memorize one society's structure, it's to see the patterns across them. The key College Board term you need to internalize is social stratification, which refers to the layered division of society into groups with unequal power and resources. Now here's a critical distinction the exam loves to test. The basis for stratification differs across societies. In some, like the Hindu caste system in South Asia, stratification is based on birth and religious status. You are born into your J, and that shapes nearly everything about your life, from your occupation to who you can marry. In Confucian China, stratification is officially based on merit and moral virtue, with scholar gentry at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and merchants. Notice that merchants sit near the bottom in the Confucian hierarchy, despite often being wealthier than farmers, and that's a classic MCQ trap. Wealth and status are not the same thing, and the exam will absolutely try to confuse you on this point. Don't fall for it. In feudal Europe and Japan, stratification is built on military service and land tenure. Lords grant land to vassals in exchange for loyalty and military obligation. This is called the feudal or manorial system in Europe and the shogunate feudal system in Japan. Here's a beautiful comparison the exam rewards. Both European knights and Japanese samurai occupy warrior elite status in their respective hierarchies. Both are bound by codes of conduct, chivalry, and bushido, and both exist within a broader agricultural economy where peasants do the actual food-producing work. But the underlying authority legitimating each system differs. European feudalism is intertwined with the Catholic Church and Christian theology, while Japanese feudalism operates under a figurehead emperor and Buddhist Shinto cultural legitimacy. Gender across regions, the architecture of patriarchy. Here's where things get nuanced, and nuance is exactly what earns you points on the FRQ. Virtually every society in this period is patriarchal, meaning men hold dominant social, economic, and political power. But patriarchy isn't a monolith. The degree, the mechanisms, and the exceptions vary significantly, and the AP exam will push you to see that variation. In China, Confucian gender ideology produced one of the most systematically documented forms of gender hierarchy in the period. The concept of the 3 obediences a woman obeys her father before marriage, her husband after marriage, and her son in widowhood gives you a precise framework to reference on the exam. The practice of foot binding, which emerged in elite classes during the Song Dynasty, is a visceral example of how gender ideology became literally embodied. It restricted women's physical mobility while simultaneously marking high social status, because only families wealthy enough to have women not doing physical labor could afford to bind feet. There's your intersection of gender and class in one image. In the Islamic world, gender roles were shaped by both Quranic law and regional custom, and this distinction matters. Islamic law formally granted women property rights, inheritance rights, and the right to initiate divorce, rights that many European women in the same period did not legally possess. But social practice often restricted women's movement and public participation. The exam wants you to see that legal status and social reality can diverge, and this is a recurring theme across unit. In the Americas, among societies like the Aztec Empire, gender roles were more rigidly defined, but included formalized roles for women in religious ceremonies and household textile production, which was economically significant. Among some West African societies, women could hold market authority and property rights within matrilineal kinship systems. Matrilineal means descent and inheritance are traced through the mother's line. Do not confuse this with matriarchy, which would mean women hold dominant political power. That conflation is one of the most common and costly mistakes on this topic. Connecting to the broader course. This topic is a thread that runs through every subsequent unit. When you reach Unit 3 and study the expansion of Islam and Christianity, ask yourself how those religious systems reinforced or modified existing gender hierarchies. When you get to Unit 4 and the Age of Exploration, notice how European patriarchal structures interact with and transform indigenous social hierarchies. In Unit 6, industrialization reshapes gender roles again as women enter factory labor, The AP exam is built around continuity and change over time, and gender hierarchy is one of the most consistent threads to trace. For FRQ scoring, remember that the College Board rewards specific evidence. Saying women were oppressed in many societies earns you nothing. Saying the Confucian three obediences doctrine in Song China codified patriarchal authority by requiring female deference to male family members at every life stage earns you a point. Precision is your currency. One last trap to avoid. Don't assume that lower status means total powerlessness. Women across regions found agency within constrained systems through religious devotion, economic activity, literary production, or family influence. Acknowledging this complexity doesn't undermine the argument for patriarchy. It actually demonstrates the sophisticated historical thinking the exam is looking for. With the social and gender structures of these civilizations firmly in mind, you're ready to zoom out and see how these internal hierarchies shaped the way different societies interacted with each other, which is exactly where we're headed next as we turn to the networks of exchange that connected these worlds. The 1.7e, the Mongol Empire as a cross-regional case study, conquest, administration, and the Pax Mongolica. Let's talk about the most powerful land empire in human history, and why it shows up on virtually every AP World History exam ever written. The Mongol Empire is not just a unit topic, it's a lens through which you can analyze trade, cultural diffusion, state building, and even disease across the entire globe. If you understand the Mongols deeply, you unlock connections that will help you answer questions from Unit 1 all the way through Unit 3. So settle in, because this one is worth your full attention. The Rise and Conquest, how Chinggis Khan built the machine. Temujin, who would take the title Chinggis Khan, meaning universal ruler, unified the fragmented Mongol tribes of the Central Asian steppe by around 1206. Think of the steppe like a giant pressure cooker of competing nomadic clans. Chinggis Khan didn't just conquer the other tribes, he reorganized them. He abolished the old tribal aristocracies and promoted soldiers based on merit and loyalty rather than bloodline. That's a radical move in a world built on kinship networks, and it gave him an army that was cohesive, disciplined, and fiercely motivated. The Mongol military machine was built on mobility and psychological warfare. Their cavalry could travel up to 100 miles a day, unheard of in the ancient world. They used feigned retreats to lure enemies out of defensive positions, then wheeled around and destroyed them. And critically, they offered cities a stark choice: surrender and pay tribute, or resist and face annihilation. Cities like Samarkand that opened their gates were often left intact and absorbed into the empire. Cities that resisted, like Nishapur and Baghdad, were subjected to massacres so total they became cautionary legends. This terror or tribute model was deliberate imperial policy, not random cruelty. It reduced the cost of conquest by making resistance seem suicidal. The AP exam loves asking you to evaluate how empires expand, and the Mongols are your go-to example for military-based expansion combined with selective administrative absorption of existing structures. Don't confuse military brutality with administrative incompetence. Those are completely separate things with the Mongols. Administration. Running the world's largest land empire. After conquest came the real challenge: administration. Here's the analogy I want you to hold on to. Imagine you just acquired 50 different companies all at once, each with its own accounting system, employees, and culture. Do you fire everyone and impose your own system from scratch? The Mongols largely said no. They were pragmatic rulers who staffed their bureaucracies with local administrators, Chinese Confucian scholars, Persian scribes, and Nestorian Christian advisors. They were religiously tolerant, one of the most genuinely pluralistic empires of the medieval world, because religious unity was simply not a priority. Stability and tax revenue were. The empire was eventually divided into 4 major regional states called Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia and the Western Steppes. Each Khanate developed distinct characteristics shaped by the cultures they ruled. The Yuan adopted Chinese bureaucratic traditions. The Ilkhanate eventually converted to Islam. This fragmentation is critical for the AP exam. After about 1260, you should think of the Mongol Empire not as a unified whole, but as 4 related but distinct states. The exam will test whether you understand this transition. A common wrong answer trap is assuming the Mongols always imposed Mongol culture on conquered peoples. The opposite is closer to the truth. They were remarkably adaptable, often becoming culturally absorbed by the civilizations they ruled, particularly in Persia and China. The Pax Mongolica, the connected world. Now, here's the concept that ties everything together for the AP exam. The Pax Mongolica, or Mongol Peace. From roughly 1250 to 1030, the Mongol Khanates controlled a continuous swath of territory from China to Eastern Europe. Under Mongol protection, the Silk Roads became safer and more active than they had been in centuries. Merchants, diplomats, missionaries, and ideas moved across Eurasia with remarkable freedom. Marco Polo's journey from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan is the most famous example, but he was one of thousands of cross-regional travelers during this era. Think of the Pax Mongolica like a highway system before the Mongols. Traveling the Silk Roads was like navigating a patchwork of local roads with different tolls, different laws, and genuine danger at every political border. Under the Mongols, the Yam system, a network of relay stations stocked with horses and supplies, meant that official messengers and merchants under Mongol protection could move goods and information at speeds previously unimaginable. Information, technology, and commodities flowed. Chinese papermaking and printing spread westward, Islamic astronomy and mathematics moved east, and crops like cotton spread to new regions. But here is the edge case the AP exam tests constantly, and it trips up so many students. The same networks that carried silk and spices also carried disease. The Black Death, the bubonic plague, traveled along these very Mongol trade routes from Central Asia westward into the Middle East and Europe in the 13040s. The Pax Mongolica was simultaneously the engine of unprecedented cross-cultural exchange and the conduit for one of history's deadliest pandemics. On a document-based question or long essay, being able to articulate this paradox, that the same mechanisms of connection can produce both prosperity and catastrophe, is exactly the kind of complexity that earns top scores. AP exam connections, and what the rubric wants for your FRQ responses. The Mongols are an almost universal example. In Unit 1, they illustrate state building and cross-cultural exchange. In Unit 2, they are central to the expansion of trade networks. When College Board asks about continuity and change in trade routes or cultural diffusion, the Mongols belong in your response. When a prompt asks about the spread of disease or demographic collapse, the Mongol trade networks are your mechanism. Watch out for the chronology trap. Chinggis Khan died in 1227. The empire reached its peak extent under his successors around 1280, and the Khanates fragmented and declined through the 1300s. Students frequently misplace these dates and conflate the unified empire with the later Khanate period. Finally, always use AP-specific language. College Board wants you to say things like cross-cultural exchange, trade networks, state consolidation, and administrative adaptations. When you describe the Pax Mongolica, frame it as a period of intensified interregional interaction that accelerated the diffusion of goods, ideas, diseases, and technologies across Eurasia. With the Mongols as your cross-regional case study firmly in hand, you're ready to zoom out and examine how the trade networks they supercharged, the Indian Ocean system, the Silk Roads, and the Trans-Saharan routes, functioned as the circulatory system of the pre-1450 Third world. 1.7f Historical Thinking Skill Comparison Constructing Thesis-Driven Comparative Arguments Across Civilizations. What comparison actually means on the AP exam. Let's start with something that trips up even well-prepared students when College Board says comparison. They don't just mean listing facts about two different places side by side. That's description, and description alone won't get you points on the AP World History Modern exam. True historical comparison, the kind that earns a 5, means constructing an argument about why similarities or differences exist and what those similarities or differences reveal about broader historical patterns. Think of it like this. If a friend asks you to compare two restaurants, you don't just recite the menu. You argue which one is better and you explain the reasoning that supports that judgment. That's the analytical move College Board is looking for. The formal College Board definition of the comparison historical thinking skill is the ability to describe, compare, and evaluate multiple historical developments within one society or across different societies in various chronological and geographical contexts. Every word there matters. Evaluate is the key verb. It signals that you need to make a judgment, not just observe a pattern. The anatomy of a thesis-driven comparative argument. Here's the single most important thing you can internalize for the AP exam. A comparative thesis must do two things simultaneously. First, it must identify a meaningful similarity or difference. Second, and this is what most students forget, it must make a historically defensible claim that explains the significance or the reason for that similarity or difference. College Board calls this a historically defensible claim that responds to the prompt with a line of reasoning. Without the line of reasoning, you have an observation, not a thesis. Imagine you're comparing the role of religious institutions in the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate around 900 CE. A weak thesis might say, the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate were both influenced by religion. That's true, but it's so obvious it's almost useless. Any grader will mark that as restating the prompt. A strong thesis sounds more like this. Although both the Byzantine Empire and the Abbasid Caliphate used religious institutions to legitimize political authority, the Byzantine model fused church and state into a single hierarchy, while the Abbasid model maintained a more distinct, though interdependent relationship between the caliph and Islamic scholars, a difference that shaped each empire's long-term political stability in fundamentally different ways. Notice what happened there. You named the similarity, legitimizing authority. You identified the key difference, how that fusion was structured, and you gestured toward the historical significance, long-term political stability. That's a thesis with a line of reasoning, and that's what College Board's rubric rewards. The compare-contrast framework you need to visualize. Think of your comparative argument as a two-column table in your mind, but the table has a third column that most students ignore entirely. Column 1 is your evidence about civilization. Column 2 is your evidence about civilization B. Column 3 is the analytical bridge, the sentence that explicitly connects the two columns and explains what the juxtaposition reveals. On the long essay question, every body paragraph should contain evidence from both sides and at least one analytical bridge sentence. Without that bridge, you're writing two separate essays stapled together, not a comparative argument. A common trap on the multiple choice questions is an answer choice that accurately describes a similarity or difference but frames it as an isolated fact rather than a pattern with causation. If a question asks you to identify a comparison that best explains an outcome, watch out for answers that are factually correct but historically disconnected from the prompt's time period or region. The College Board loves to place a true statement in an answer choice that belongs to a different century or a different context. It's accurate but irrelevant to the comparison being asked. Similarities, differences, and the both-and trap. One of the most seductive wrong moves in comparative writing is what you might call the both-and trap. Students write an entire paragraph explaining how both civilizations shared a particular feature, and then they stop, as if recognizing a similarity is the destination rather than the starting point. The AP rubric for the DBQ and LEQ explicitly requires that you use evidence to support an argument, not just to demonstrate knowledge. Every similarity or difference you identify should be in service of a larger claim about how or why history unfolded the way it did. Here's a practical rule to memorize. Whenever you write the words similarly or in contrast, your very next clause should begin with because, which suggests, which reveals, or this reflects the broader pattern of. Force yourself to finish the analytical thought. If you can't complete the sentence with a because, you haven't written analysis yet. Connecting comparison to the rest of AP World History Modern. Comparison is not a skill you use in isolation. It runs like a thread through every unit of this course. In Unit 2, you'll compare the trade networks of the Indian Ocean with those of the Silk Roads. In Unit 3, you'll compare the expansion methods of land-based empires like the Ottomans and Mughals with one another and with maritime empires. In Units 4 and 5, comparison becomes essential for understanding the diverging industrialization paths of Europe versus Asia and the Americas. The College Board consistently rewards students who can reach across time periods within a comparative argument. For instance, noting that a pattern you observe in 1200 CE either persists, evolves, or reverses by 1750 CE. That kind of continuity and change thinking layered onto a comparison is what separates good answers from outstanding ones. One edge case worth knowing cold. Sometimes the AP exam asks you to compare within a single civilization. For example, comparing the political structure of the early Abbasid Caliphate to its later decentralized period. That is still a comparison in College Board's framework, just across time rather than across geography. Don't let the absence of two different civilizations make you think comparison doesn't apply. The one rule to walk into the exam with. If you remember nothing else from this section, remember this. Comparison on the AP exam is not a description of two things. It is an argument about what the relationship between two things reveals. Your thesis names the similarity or difference. Your body paragraphs prove it with specific evidence from both sides. Your analytical bridges explain why it matters. Every sentence you write should be earning a point or supporting a sentence that earns a point. With that comparative framework locked in, you're perfectly positioned for what comes next, because in the following section, we're going to look at how causation and continuity and change interact with comparison when you're tackling the most demanding FRQ prompts on the exam. 1.7G Contextualization Skill. Situating Unit 1, Developments within Long-Term Patterns Preceding C1200. What contextualization actually means and why it's not what you think. Let's start with an honest confession. Contextualization is one of the most misunderstood skills on the entire AP World History exam. Students hear the word and think, oh, I'll just mention something that happened around the same time. Wrong move, and that mistake costs points constantly. Think of contextualization less like decorating a cake and more like explaining why the cake exists in the first place. You're not just dropping a historical fact nearby. You're showing how a broader pattern, trend, or process shaped the specific development you're analyzing. For Unit 1, that means you need to reach backward before c. 1200 CE and explain how long-term forces set the stage for everything happening in the period from roughly 1200 to 1450. Imagine you're explaining why a particular neighborhood looks the way it does today. You wouldn't start by describing today's coffee shops and condos. You'd explain the geological features that made the land desirable, the migration patterns that brought people there, the trade routes that once ran through it. That backstory contextualizes the present. That's your job here. The long-term patterns you must know cold. The AP exam expects you to identify specific pre-120 patterns that created the conditions Unit 1 civilizations operated within. Let's walk through the most essential ones. First, the rise and spread of world religions. Islam emerged in the 7th century CE, and by 1200 it had already swept across the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, Central Asia, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. Buddhism had been spreading along Silk Road networks since roughly the 3rd century BCE. Christianity had divided into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions by 1054 CE. These weren't just theological events, they were civilizational frameworks that shaped law, trade ethics, gender norms, literacy, and political legitimacy. When you're writing about the Abbasid Caliphate or the Song Dynasty's Confucian bureaucracy in Unit 1, your contextualization should connect to these long-term religious and philosophical traditions that were centuries in the making. Second, the classical trade networks. The Silk Roads, Indian Ocean trade system, and trans-Saharan routes didn't spring up in 1200. The Silk Roads had been connecting China to Rome since roughly the 2nd century BCE. The Indian Ocean Dhow trade was already ancient by the time of the Gupta Empire. When you contextualize the commercial dynamism of the Song Dynasty or the wealth of Mali, you're pointing to these networks as deep, pre-existing infrastructure like roads already paved before Unit 1 travelers ever set foot on them. Third, the legacy of classical empires. Rome, Han China, the Gupta Empire, and the Persian Achaemenids had all collapsed or contracted by the 7th or 8th centuries CE, but their legacies were very much alive in 1200. The Byzantine Empire preserved Roman law and Greek learning. The Tang dynasty, which preceded the Song, consciously modeled itself on Han administrative ideals. The Abbasid Caliphate translated Greek philosophical texts into Arabic, creating a knowledge bridge that would eventually flow into medieval Europe. Contextualization here means recognizing that Unit 1 societies were inheriting, adapting, and responding to classical precedents, not inventing from scratch. How to write a contextualization argument that earns the point. The College Board is very specific about what earns this point on the DBQ and LEQ. Your contextualization must do two things. It must describe a broader historical context, and it must explain how that context is relevant to the argument. Just mentioning the Silk Roads isn't enough. You need a sentence or two that says, in effect, because of X long-term pattern, the developments of Unit 1 were shaped in Y specific way. Here's the key structural move. Set up your contextualization in an introductory paragraph before your thesis, not after it. Think of it as the runway before the plane takes off. You're telling the reader, here's the world that existed, and here's why that world made what I'm about to argue possible or inevitable. A strong contextualization for a Unit 1 prompt about trade might sound like this. For centuries before 1200, the Silk Roads had connected Eurasian civilizations, spreading not only goods but also technologies, diseases, and religious ideas. This long-established infrastructure of exchange created the conditions under which Song China could emerge as a commercial powerhouse, since merchants, credit systems, and navigational knowledge were already deeply embedded across the network. Notice what's happening there. You're reaching back, describing the long-term pattern, and then explicitly connecting it forward to the Unit 1 development. That's the move. The MCQ traps you need to sidestep. On multiple choice questions, contextualization traps usually work like this. A question asks you to identify the broader historical context for a development, and the wrong answers either describe something simultaneous with the development that's a connection, not contextualization, or something too narrow, a specific event rather than a pattern or trend. Always ask yourself, is this answer describing a long-term process that preceded and shaped the specific development? If it's describing something that happened at the exact same time, or is just a restatement of the development itself, it's almost certainly wrong. Another common trap is confusing causation with coincidence. Just because two things happened in the same era doesn't mean one contextualizes the other. The Crusades and the Mongol invasions both happened around 1200. But citing the Crusades to contextualize Song Dynasty economics requires you to actually explain the mechanism of connection, and that's hard to do legitimately. Stick to patterns where the relationship is clear and defensible. Connecting this skill across the course. Here's why. Mastering pre-1200 contextualization in Unit 1 pays dividends all year long. Every subsequent unit has its own contextualization demands, and they all rely on patterns established in earlier units. Unit 2's Mongol Empire is contextualized by the very Silk Road networks and nomadic traditions you're learning about now. Unit 3's European Renaissance is contextualized by the recovery and translation of classical Greek and Islamic learning, again, patterns rooted before 1200. Unit 4's Age of Exploration is contextualized by the collapse of overland Mongol trade routes and the long pre-existing desire to access Asian markets directly. If you train yourself to look backward for long-term patterns every time you encounter a new development, you'll have the contextualization habit locked in for every FRQ you write this year. The deeper you understand these pre-1200 foundations, the more clearly you'll see Unit 1 not as a starting point, but as a midpoint in much longer human stories, and that's exactly the perspective the AP exam rewards. Speaking of longer stories, let's move forward now into how the College Board assesses your understanding of Unit 1 as a whole, and what the DBQ and LAQ prompts for this period typically look like, so you know exactly what's coming when you open that exam.